adventurers, my name is Kramer, and after 5 drafts of this video, over 13,000 words in the script, the time has come once again for us to discuss new Lord of the Rings media. This time in the form of the War of the Rohirrim, written by Philippa Boyens, directed by Kenji Kamiyama, and then produced by Warner Brothers and New Line. This is going to be a long one. You knew that when you clicked on the video. You knew what you were signing up for, so strap in. So this recent release, The War of the Rohirrim, did have me cautiously optimistic for new Lord of the Rings media. I did have things that I was going to be on the lookout going into this, things that were going to displease me should I have seen them, and I'm happy to be able to say that I did in fact really enjoy this movie, and I thought it was a very good adaptation, and I know some people are going to bristle at that, but all of this will be addressed. We will of course discuss how this movie is categorically different from the Rings of Power, and to attack it with the same lines of attack that we used against the Rings of Power is not really strategically viable. We will discuss how calling this movie woke is both incorrect in and of itself and also self-defeating as a tactic in the grand scheme of things. We will discuss how using the term woke in media analysis is more or less just a useless buzzword that doesn't really accomplish very much of it all, even if the critique itself is well-intentioned or deserved. We will discuss how ultimately backing this movie, a massive amount of momentum from the Tolkien fanbase specifically, is kind of the only chance we have at making any tangible change when it comes to adaptations. And I will, of course, inevitably find myself at odds with a lot of political reviewers and content creators over this, even though we were on the same side for the Rings of Power. In this case, a lot of their takes are very different than mine. A lot of people will see this as me switching sides. That isn't the case. It just so happens that we have different analysis of the same subject. But first and foremost, of course, we will discuss the merits of this film as a Tolkien adaptation. Because ultimately, I think that there are a lot of people who don't really care about the politics and don't really care about the culture war quite as much, and they just wanted a good movie, in this case, a Lord of the Rings movie unmolested by ideology on either side, adapted faithfully and tastefully. So my goal is to prove to you that this is a good movie and that it's a very faithful adaptation. Not 100% faithful, more like 85 to 95% faithful, like the rest of Peter Jackson's adaptations. I know our blood is hot coming off of the Rings of Power. I know a lot of people are scared of being burnt again, but you do seriously have to listen to me because I made a whole video about this happening about a year ago. Everything that I said would happen in regards to the new Warner Brothers movies has more or less come to pass. It's unfortunate that the things that have come to pass are the traps that I said that we should avoid falling into, and we kind of did, but it's okay. We can still come back from this. But you do have to listen to me because I did predict all of this. The biggest complaint with the Rings of Power was that it politicized Tolkien. I mean, it also attacked the fans, but it did that by virtue of politicizing Tolkien and telling us that we should be okay with that. So its biggest sin was politicizing Tolkien. It therefore wasn't Tolkien, and that's why we had to fight it. We did fight it, we beat it, we won. But this movie does not commit the same sins. But this time there are elements within the fandom, or at least independents, that would claim to be speaking for the fandom when they're actually maybe not even part of it to begin with, that are now guilty of politicizing Tolkien anyway, even though the movie itself does not do this. I am not a social justice warrior for any particular side. I am not altogether on anybody's side, as no one is altogether on my side. I am a fan of The Lord of the Rings, and all of my critiques, whether positive or negative, visceral, or highly praiseworthy, are coming from that perspective, completely unhindered by ideology. My goal, as always, is to defend The Lord of the Rings. Sometimes that means defending the books in the face of a faithless and terribly made adaptation, as was the case with the Rings of Power. And sometimes that means defending a good adaptation in the face of detractors, as is the case here. And ultimately, at a certain point, as I give this very long disclaimer, I'm gonna have to just accept that I'm never gonna please everybody. And ultimately, I was prepared to lose subscribers over my visceral takedowns of the Rings of Power, and I am prepared to lose them here as well, because the truth is the thing that's most important to me, and I'm not going to sacrifice my integrity just to say something that I think the people are expecting to hear. This was a good movie, and I'm about to prove it to you. So let's first talk about the lore. I like this movie. I do have some complaints about it, but who doesn't these days? But ultimately, I just wanted to get all of that out of the way, so spoilers to follow. It is not possible to talk about this movie without talking about the lore, and it's not possible to talk about the lore without spoiling the movie, because that's how accurate to the lore this movie is. So if you read the very short passage about Helm Hammerhand in the book, which is right over here, not with the rest of the box set because I was using it for research for this video, if you read the passage on Helm Hammerhand from the appendices, you know exactly what happens in this movie. So the background for this movie is that it is based on approximately 2 pages in the appendices at the end of The Return of the King, in the section, the Appendices A, Chapter 2, The House of Eorl, in which Tolkien briefly describes the legend of Helm Hammerhand. This legend is something that does exist. It is something that Tolkien wrote about in basic plot points like footnotes. That's essentially what the appendices are. And we know more or less from what Tolkien describes what happened, who was there, and like roughly when. from those 2 pages. The appendices exist to broaden the scope and the fabric and the history of Middle-earth, and it more or less simply tells us that other stories and legends exist within the Tolkien legendarium, but the appendices do not claim at any point to be stories in and of themselves. In fact, Tolkien actually writes that in the beginning of the appendices. He says that the legends, histories, and lore to be found in the sources are very extensive. Only sections from them, in most places much abridged, are here presented. Whether or not this is actually enough material to even try to make an adaptation off of, or whether or not that is in fact a good idea, is a completely different conversation, which we will touch on shortly. But the ultimate question here is, how true is this movie to the lore? Because this is the line that a lot of people are taking. I have seen some people saying that this movie, The War of the Rohirrim, butchers the lore like irredeemably. And I simply do not believe this is the case. Having watched the movie and of course being familiar with the lore itself, I do not see how this movie butchers the lore. And despite having watched many videos claiming that this is the case, I also haven't found a single video explaining to me how this movie butchers the lore, and there certainly isn't any consensus among the people claiming this to begin with, so the attacks are very sparse and none of them are aligned with each other. So are there changes, ultimately? Are there changes from the lore for this movie? Yes. Are there additions to the lore from this movie? Of course there are. It's an adaptation based on 2 pages. In the lore, Tolkien describes the following, and that is quite simply that there is this landlord Freka, and he asks to marry Helm's daughter, who Tolkien does not name, to his own son Wolf. So Wolf is Freka's son. Helm then insults Freka by calling him fat, and everybody laughs, and then Helm punches Freka in the face and kills him almost instantly with just a single blow, and then he banishes Wolf, Freka's son, never to return to the lands of Rohan again. Then 4 years later, Rohan is attacked by Easterlings, and at the same time the Dunlandings, who are now led by Wolf, take this as an opportunity to attack Rohan as well. Gondor at this time is under attack from 3 fleets from the Corsairs of Umbar, so they're unable to help. So Helm's oldest son, Haleth, is killed in action defending Edoras, and the Rohirrim are handed their first defeat by the Dunlandings, and they are forced to retreat to their strongholds around Rohan, and Helm goes to Helm's Deep. At that point, it was called the Hornburg. Helm and the rest of the Rohirrim are then besieged at the Hornburg for a total of 5 months during what is called the Long Winter, during which time Helm's other son, Hamma, goes out on a scouting mission to retrieve food and try to break through the enemy lines, and he's lost in the snow, never to be seen again. Helm then, through his grief and despair, goes out every single night and he kills the Dunlandings with his bare hands, and every night he blows his horn as this herald of woe, and every night he goes out and he slaughters more and more of the sieging force, and he just becomes this legendary and horrific figure in Dunlanding lore. They are afraid of him and they fear him and they talk about it for generations to come, until one night they hear the horn blow and then nothing happens, and in the morning dawn breaks with the sun for the first time in this very long winter, and they find Helm standing there, knees unbent, dead as stone, frozen in place. Shortly after this, winter breaks, and Helm's nephew, named Freylof, son of Hild, comes down out of Dunharrow with a number of the Rohirrim that have rallied there, and he defeats Wolf at Edoras. By the end of the year, Rohan has joined forces with Gondor, so Freylof and Beren, the then steward of Gondor, team up and they drive the Dunlandings out of Isengard and up into the mountains, and then Freylof is crowned the king. Saruman the White is at Freylof's coronation, and they're very happy to have what they perceive to be an ally in that area, so they give him Isengard and they hand him the keys to Orthanc. And that is the story. That is the story in the lore as Tolkien has written it down. As Tolkien writes it, Helm and Freka are the only characters that have any written dialogue, and once Freka is dead after like the 2nd paragraph, there is no more dialogue at all. It is quite simply the historical recounting of events in the appendices as Tolkien writes it. It's not told from the perspective of Helm Hammerhand, nor any other character. There's no POV. It is simply a historical narration of events. So I have just described in its entirety the legend of Helm Hammerhand as Tolkien has described it. If it sounds as if I have also described the major plot points from the War of the Rohirrim movie, it's because I have. That's how lore accurate it is. Tolkien wrote 2 pages about this, and everything that he wrote happened in the movie. And of those 2 pages, more is ripped directly from Tolkien's own words and then used in the film as either narrative exposition or dialogue specifically than isn't ripped from the actual book itself. The story begins and ends exactly as Tolkien has described it, with none of the additions changing, ruining, or otherwise drastically coming into conflict with the lore as Tolkien set it to paper. No part of the overarching story changes at all due due to the events in this film. The addition of Hera as the eyes through which we see the events of this film and the fleshing out of her story and of her character was entirely expected, necessary, and unobtrusive to the work as a whole, at least in my opinion, and of course all of this will be addressed. So first, again, still talking about the lore, let's talk about some of the changes that the movie made from the books. I can't really say in the books because that implies that there's more than one book about Helm Hammerhand. There isn't. I want to remind everybody that there's just 2 pages written about this. So in the appendices, the way that Hama dies is slightly different than it is portrayed in the movie. In the book, he simply disappears on a hunting or a scouting mission. He's lost in the snow, never to be seen again. No one sees him die. No one knows how he dies. They just never find him again. So in the movie, he is captured during the flight from Edoras to Helm's Deep, and then he's executed slightly earlier in the timeline. Now, I personally wish that he'd been kept around for a little bit longer so that we could have seen him bond with the rest of his family. This is a direct change from what Tolkien wrote. It's not reconcilable with what Tolkien wrote because in the book, nobody knows how he died, but in the movie, there are direct witnesses to his execution. So both can't be true at the same time. That's what I mean by they're not reconcilable. Though I suppose in a sort of roundabout way, in the movie, his body still is lost to the snow because they do just leave it there for the entire siege and they don't ever say that it's recovered. So technically correct. And originally I wasn't a fan of this change and I was gonna posit a way that I would personally reread it. But when I watched the movie for the second time, I realized why they did this. And it's because it made me hate Wolf in this moment. And it takes him from being what might have been perceived as a slightly sympathetic or at least justified character who was seeking recompense for the wrongful death of his father over a marriage proposal gone wrong to someone who was like actively choosing to be villainous. So Helm and Hera had to watch Wolf kill both Haleth and Hama right in front of them. And I don't think that this would have worked emotionally the same way if we had seen Hama go out and then Wolf kills him, but Helm isn't there to witness it. We really needed him to see that happen for those emotional stakes to be there. So while it is a change from the lore, narratively for the telling of the movie story, I do think that the change makes sense. And ultimately, it doesn't actually affect or otherwise break the continuity of the canon as a whole, as the main thing, which is that Hama dies, still happens. Another change is that the final confrontation, as it happens in the lore, is at Edoras between Freyloth and Wolf specifically, whereas in the movie they changed that to just all happening at what is now called Helm's Deep, the Hornburg. And this was very obviously changed just to cut down time and improve the narrative flow of the movie. And obviously we come to the biggest change, the most controversial change probably for a lot of people, which is that in the lore it is Freyloth that kills Wolf, whereas in the movie, it is Hera who is Helm's daughter in the movie. So while this is a direct change, it is not one that ripples into shifting any of the other plot points around it. Freyloth still becomes the king, Wolf still dies, and Hera ultimately then disappears from the annals of history. And I can understand making this change from a narrative perspective, as they sort of have set up Hera and Wolf to have this history together, which makes sense because their potential for marriage was kind of the whole thing that started the war to begin with, so it made sense to try to pair the two of them together. Having that history set up, but then not watching Hera fight him at the end would be a little bit like watching Arya Stark come in at the end of Game of Thrones and kill the Night King instead of letting Jon Snow do it, so it would have been unsatisfying and anticlimactic to have Freyloth just come in at the last minute and kill him somewhere else. So in my opinion, this change is justified, and it gives the conflict more weight in the movie version, and it provides more motivation and tension for Wolf and for Hera, who, yes, we will address more in depth later. Suffice it to say for now that she's not a completely made-up character out of whole cloth. She does have to be there. Tolkien says that very explicitly. Helm does have a daughter. They didn't just invent a daughter for him. She is part of the story. Tolkien said so. And I would have enjoyed a version of the movie with a much larger scope that had battles happening potentially in multiple places, both at Edoras and Helm's Deep. Though a complaint with this film from a lot of people is that it already is too long, but I might have better enjoyed a version where perhaps Hera succeeds in helping her people survive at Helm's Deep after the death of her father, but yes, it is ultimately Freyloth who then defeats Wolf at Edoras like in the book. But then again, we run into that problem of if you're gonna do that, you can't tie Wolf and Hera as closely together, which means there's a lot less emotional impact happening in the movie. The final sort of major character change is that in the lore, Freylof does not appear until like the last couple of paragraphs. He's never talked about, and then he just suddenly appears, whereas in the movie, Freylof is there pretty much from the very beginning. And in my opinion, this is a very obvious and necessary change. I don't think anyone's actually complaining about this. We needed to know who Freylof was. We needed to be introduced to him as a concept and as a potential character in order for him not to feel like this out-of-place random deus ex machina when he comes in at the very end of the movie. It works that way in the lore because in the lore it's set up like a historical account. Like this happened and then this happened and then this happened, and Tolkien doesn't ever really need to explain how or why those things happened. It's just important that we know that they did, but you can't really do that in a movie without making it feel really, really weird. So this was a necessary change, and I'm glad that they did it. So now let's talk a little bit about its merits as an adaptation. Let's talk a little bit about adaptations in general. This is an adaptation based on 2 pages. They were always going to have to make additions. It was either they don't make the movie at all, or they have to add something. The question is not a case of whether or not they should have just stuck entirely to the lore and only did what Tolkien wrote. The question is, what do you add? Do you have the wisdom to know when to add it and how to add it in a way that is respectful? This is the obviously predictable byproduct of adapting something that truly has such limited source material. Yes, it's the same defense that the Rings of Power used, but it didn't apply to the Rings of Power where it does actually apply to the War of the Rohirrim, and that's why it's insidious that the Rings of Power attempted to use it, because they were using the truth to defend a lie, which for some reason makes some people feel the need to throw out the truth along with the lie too, which is wrong. But we all intrinsically understand that adaptations do make changes and do make additions. Not all adaptations do this, and some adaptations do it better than others, but when the source material is so limited, you have to do that. The Rings of Power said, how can we tell the story that Tolkien never wrote? And use the truth that adaptations do make changes and additions from the source material as an excuse to defend rewriting a story that Tolkien actually did write. The difference with the War of the Rohirrim is that Tolkien actually didn't write it as a full story. And in this case, the writers have to fill in the gaps, not because they think they can do it better than Tolkien or because they want to ruin Tolkien, but because adding a story to what is essentially bullet points is the only way to tell a story. A true, like, one-for-one adaptation of the story of Helm, Hammerhand, and the War of the Rohirrim from book to screen would be like 7 to 10 minutes long. You have to add dialogue. You have to write dialogue. In order to write dialogue, you have to write characters. Characters that are not really described or fleshed out at all in the appendices as Tolkien writes them down. The writing team for this movie have clearly done everything in their power to write what they had to do while taking very great pains not to step on the chronology of the timeline or the overarching lore that Tolkien wrote. And that's honestly why certain moments in the movie may feel contrived to some people, because they had source material that they had to adhere to. They had to get from point A to point B and hit all of the stops in between, but the direct route between all of those stops doesn't exist. So the best that you can do is logically deduce what happened in between all of those things that Tolkien said had to happen. It's a little bit like trying to recreate a chess game without knowing what all of the moves were because they weren't written down. You know where all the pieces started, you know where all the pieces ended, you know who won at the end of the game, and occasionally Tolkien will tell you, well, on move 12, knight moved to h4. So you may not end up being able to recreate an absolutely identical chess game, but you can copy everything that you do know happens. You know, perhaps the knight didn't start on the correct square as it did in the original game, but Tolkien never said what square it started on. You just logically have to figure it out. There's only so many squares that the knight can be on in order to end up on h4. And then if you take into account where all the rest of the pieces are on the board at that point of the game, that narrows down your choices even further. So it might not be the exact square, but we know that it ends up on h4 on move 12. And this is quite honestly expected for me. It's a common thing with the Peter Jackson adaptations. If you're someone that just simply doesn't like Lord of the Rings adaptations to begin with, and you were a book purist and a book loyalist, I absolutely respect that. But if you are someone that does like movie adaptations, but you just think that the War of the Rohirrim is a bad one, I'm going to continue to explain why it's actually good. In the Jackson adaptations, events don't always happen exactly the way that Tolkien describes them happening. Lines aren't always said by the same people that Tolkien said them, or they're not always said or done when they happen in the books. Things aren't always done by the correct people Tolkien said did them, but the deeds do still happen in the movies, the events still happen, and the lines are still said, and the changes are then justified logically within the movie's own internal narrative by improving narrative flow, emotional and dramatic effect, or clarifying the timeline. And when Peter Jackson and his team make these changes, they're always logically justified. They're never just random. It's not like, oh, well, our version is different and adaptations are different, so we decided to make Frodo the King of Gondor at the end of the Return of the King. Like the Rings of Power would probably do, where they change the origin of the rings for absolutely no reason, or make up a brand new character for Sauron to be just for the sake of having a mystery box. Changes can be done logically to enhance the story of the film without rewriting the books. It's difficult, it's very hard, but Peter Jackson, Philippa Boyens, and Fran Walsh consistently prove that they're able to do that. So here's a very fine example of positive changes from books to movies in a way that makes sense. So in the book, right before the Battle of Pelennor Fields, Theoden says, "Oath ye have taken, now fulfill them all to Lord and Land and League of Friendship," which sounds very much like an anime line, and also may have sounded very out of place, silly even, given the tone of Peter Jackson's movies, which is probably why they omitted that part of the line, like they omitted all of the songs for the tone of the movies. Now, in addition to that, in the movie, it's actually Éomer who says this line, and he says it far before the Battle of Pelennor Fields. He says it as the Rohirrim is leaving Edoras, before they go muster at Dun Harrow to begin with, so that's another change. But the line was still said, and it still retained the same meaning, so this is a change that doesn't really bother me. And they still managed to keep the idea and the sentiment of this line and the idea of friendship, because right before the charge of Pelennor Fields, Éowyn whispers to Merry, courage for our friends." So they changed the line to preserve the tone of the movie. They kept the sentiment to preserve the theme and the emotion, and they kept a portion of the original line as to remain as faithful as possible to the books. And in this scene, a section of Éomer's own speech, which happens in the books after Theoden is killed, where they chant death. That actually happened. Éomer is the one that says that in the books, but they give it to Theoden before the charge in the movies, and this is another change. And you will quite simply never convince me that that wasn't a very epic moment for the movies, and I would never want to see that in the movies a different way. Yes, it's a change from the books. The sentiment is still the same. Now, the fairest criticism of the War of the Rohirrim as an adaptation, the fairest criticism, and one that I cannot argue against because it's completely subjective, is quite simply that things in the movie weren't changed or adapted in the way that people would have wanted to see them changed or adapted. Like, you might have wanted to see Freyalaf or Helm be the POV characters instead, and that's fine. I can imagine a version of the movie where maybe that happened, and that would have been good too. But the fact remains that as an adaptation, it got us from point A to point B, and we stopped at all of the pit stops along the way that Tolkien said that we had to stop at. The horse ended up on H4 on move 12, and it might not have gotten us there in the way that some people would have preferred, or the way that some people were expecting, but it did get us there. So by that definition, it is in fact a faithful adaptation, even if some people didn't like it. And perhaps this is why I'm not overly upset about this movie, because I didn't want to see any particular version. I didn't want to see my adaptation. I had no expectations for what this movie was supposed to be. I knew it was going to be about the War of the Rohirrim. I knew that Helm was going to be a major character in it, and he was. And ultimately, I just wanted to see a good and faithful adaptation where the things that I read about happened in the movie, and they did, and that's why I'm happy with it. So the elephant in the room is that this adaptation is an anime rather than a live-action film. And some people have balked at this as if Lord of the Rings has never been adapted in cartoon form before, even though it has. So whether or not you like watching anime or whether or not you like watching Lord of the Rings as a cartoon is completely subjective, so I can't tell you whether or not you're going to enjoy it, but what I can say is that I am personally predisposed to enjoying the Lord of the Rings as an anime, or rather as a cartoon, because my first introduction to the Lord of the Rings was actually not the books or Peter Jackson's films, but was actually the Ralph Bakshi film from 1978. So we rented the film back when Netflix was still sending out discs in sets of 3. I watched it when I was about 5, and then I eventually moved on to the Rankin and Bass films, The Hobbit in 1977 and The Return of the King in 1980, respectively. And then eventually my parents were like, you know, there's live action movies. And I was like, there are? And then after that, they were like, and there's books too. And my heart was glad. But suffice it to say that the Rankin and Bass films and the Ralph Bakshi cartoon hold a very special place in my heart. So quick history lesson here. The Rankin and Bass films used an animation company called Topcraft, founded by a gentleman named Toru Hara. And the company also created the movie Nausicaa, The Valley of the Wind in 1984, which is one of my all-time favorite anime movies. And so when Topcraft Animation Studios went bankrupt the following year in 1985, its assets were purchased by Hayao Miyazaki, Toshio Suzuki, and Isao Takahata, and they formed what then became Studio Ghibli, where Toru Hara, the original founder of Topcraft, served as their main manager for a number of their beginning years. So in a very, very real sense, the original Lord of the Rings adaptations were animes. Now, the producer and writer and consultant for The War of the Rohirrim and one of the main 3 original writers from the original trilogy, Philippa Boyens, comments on this very fact in an interview with the Nerd of the Rings about The War of the Rohirrim. She is very aware of the lineage of these Tolkien adaptations, which for the record are also not 100% accurate adaptations, but I do think that they're very good adaptations, and in some ways maybe better. Maybe better is not the right word, but they're at least more accurate in a different way than the Peter Jackson adaptations. And quite frankly, when I'm reading the books, I actually picture the cartoon characters instead of Jackson's cast. And that's just because it's simply easier for me to imagine the characters as cartoons, as they are more malleable in my imagination, because cartoons are sort of like this low-res distillation of the idea or the emotion of a character, rather than actually having to like physically render Elijah Wood's entire beautiful face in my head every time I'm reading the books. So I've seen some people comment on the animation saying that it seemed cheap or it was too choppy or it was missing frames. And again, this is subjective, as when I watched the movie the first time, I didn't notice it, and then after I saw enough people point it out, I was like looking for it specifically, and then on my second time I was like, okay, I guess I can see how people would think that. But my biggest thing with it being an anime, the thing that I was really hoping not to see was them using 3D doubles of the anime characters, which is a very sort of modern trend. It would be an indication of the animation studio maybe cheaping out in certain scenes. You know what I'm talking about, where you go from a 2D version of a character to a 3D shell-shaded version of the character. And a lot of modern animes do this, from a lot of the newer Berserk anime movies to the newer seasons of Attack on Titan, and it's just really jarring when that happens. So I'm pleased to say that that didn't happen. And in terms of the animation itself being choppy, it's possible that they'll fix it for a digital release or a home release, but it's also possible that it's intended and that it's because it's completely hand animated and that it isn't 60 frames per second. And a common complaint with a lot of newer fantasy style movies or TV shows, including The Hobbit, The Rings of Power, the Netflix's The Witcher, is that it all seems too smooth and too clean. And they lack that sort of nostalgic, filmic, slightly faded and hazy quality that the original trilogy has. So in that light, I think that maybe some people might be able to better appreciate this animation style as being an updated, in terms of quality and clarity, version of an animation, but while still being reminiscent of older animation styles. And in this way, I think it's going to pair a lot better with the original Tolkien cartoons from Rankin Bass and Ralph Bakshi, without being so drastically far ahead of them in terms of their animation quality that you can't watch them next to each other without hating the originals. So getting to see The Lord of the Rings in cartoon form again, but this time in the Peter Jackson universe, is kind of like a best of all worlds dream come true for me, so I was very happy with it. And in my opinion, this is clearly not an anime simply to jump on the trend, because everything is an anime nowadays. Because while it's true that a live-action adaptation would have been more expensive than an anime, I do not believe that the cost was the main driving factor for this being an animated film, and I'm kind of skeptical of the people who say this, because there are other arguments to be made, and I'm about to make them. So it was, at least in my opinion, an artistic choice with a narrative purpose to make this film an anime. So compared to the Witcher anime, this movie did actually feel like an anime. Anime has certain themes and certain narrative structures, the way it uses music, the way it uses visuals to tell the story. It has certain things about it that make it an anime. And anime often also explores themes that are actually very similar to Tolkien. In fact, anime is probably the only genre of TV or movie media that still explore these themes to the same emotional effect that Tolkien did. The idea of the eucatastrophe, which is something that Tolkien created, the sudden happening of something very positive and hopeful in what is otherwise a very negative and hopeless situation, that is something that anime does all of the time. And of course, the Japanese virtue of gambare, which means to keep going or to carry on or persevere, especially in the face of adversity or insurmountable odds. And the idea of overcoming obstacles through perseverance, or fighting through even if you know, or at least think you know, that you are going to lose, and valuing friendship and what is good and what is right above what is powerful, and the overarching themes of death and of sacrifice and loss. These are all themes that apply both to anime and to Tolkien. Now, The Witcher anime was directed and produced by Kwan Han-il, who does not have a history of creating Japanese animes. He has a history of creating Western cartoons, sort of loosely in an anime style, including for Marvel and DC. It is an anime in name only that felt a little bit more like watching Young Justice than it did an actual anime from Japan. The director of War of the Rohirrim, by contrast, Kenji Kamiyama, is responsible for the Ghost in the Shell movies, Eden of the East, And he also did Moribito, The Rise of the Spirit Guardian, which is one of my all-time favorite TV shows, anime TV shows. Meaning that here we have an anime, not simply in name, and not simply for the trend of calling it an anime, but an anime in its essence, directed by one of the greatest anime directors and screenwriters available currently. And that alone should prove that having it be an anime was on purpose, because if they just wanted to jump on it for a trend or for a cash grab, they could have picked anybody, but they chose the best of the best in this field to direct it. So in this sense, I think it's not a cash grab, it's not just marketing, because it being an anime is an authentic reflection of what it actually is. So the big question here, which I'm assuming a lot of people are most interested in, is, well, why did this movie have to be an anime? And I would first ask that we reanalyze the use of the word have, because this movie could have been something else. But I think a better question is, does this movie work as an anime? And if so, how? And that is a question that I can endeavor to answer. This is my case, that it serves to separate myth from reality. As I have explained, a cartoon or an anime character is a distillation of the most essential parts of a real, full, live human being. It is an impression rather than the real objective thing. The same way that a myth is an impression or a distillation of a true story. The Legend of Helm Hammerhand is just that, a legend. Making it an anime serves to tell this story. It separates the movie as the telling of a mythical legend compared to the objective recounting of events in the original Lord of the Rings trilogy and in The Hobbit as live action films. It is the difference between a tapestry or a painting depicting an event and an actual photograph of the event itself, which for the record would diminish its mythic quality. This is further backed up by the way that the actual appendices are presented to us and the way that this movie is narrated by Éowyn to us, the viewer. This is not just a story being told to us as the audience. It has always been a legend told by other characters within Middle-earth to each other. The Lord of the Rings movies brought the camera directly into Middle-earth to show us the objective events that happened as Tolkien described them. Thus, it was real. Thus, it was live action. This movie tells a myth within that world, told to us through the perspective of one of the characters within that world, being Éowyn. Thus, it is not live action. Thus, it is a story within a story, not a memory within a story, like Balin when he's recounting the attempt to retake Moria, where he was actually there as a living witness. That makes sense to be live action too. But in this case, this is a mythic legend with no living witnesses being passed down orally by one of the characters within the overarching story of The Lord of the Rings. So this movie, as an anime, is separated from The Lord of the Rings as a live action film. So the follow-up question to that defense is, well, would this have worked better as a live action film? And again, this is subjective, but in my opinion, no, because Helm Hammerhand is a legend. He's this larger than life figure, and I don't think that I would have found it quite as believable to see an actually old man punching people into armor so hard that they die. I mean, his last stand in the anime is very epic and it's very believable, because in an anime you can sort of get away with stuff like that. But in live action, I think it would have felt really unrealistic. I don't know how they would have choreographed it in a way that didn't seem campy. I mean, like, who could we have even cast for a live action Helm Hammerhand? Like, I don't think it would have been Brian Cox. Because in the movie, like, Helm is just this absolute mountain chad of a man. That's another point in the anime's favor, is that it allows you to create the characters exactly as would fit what Tolkien describes, although in this case Tolkien actually doesn't describe how any of the characters look aside from Freka, but it allows you to create these characters without having to worry about casting, and then you can just pick the exact right voice, in this case Brian Cox, who does an excellent job without having to worry about the casting. So I think that the anime or cartoon style actually provides the perfect answer to some of the stories that I never would have wanted to see adapted with a live cast because they felt too sacred. For example, and I'm on record as saying this, the story of Beren and Luthien is very beautiful. It's like directly tied to Tolkien specifically with him and his wife. So it's like such a mythic story. It has such romantic quality to it that I don't ever want to see it adapted with live people, because casting actors to fill those roles would be essentially an impossible task. And at least it would be impossible to please everybody. And because casting live actors sort of implicitly and objectively says, this is Beren and this is Luthien, and it doesn't really allow any room for interpretation. It's like an objective statement, but a cartoon, similar to a sketch or a painting, is sort of one step removed from that. It's a little bit softer of a claim, and it simply says, this is one artist's rendition of what Beren and Luthien might have looked like, and I'd be more willing to accept a Beren and Luthien adaptation in cartoon form or in anime form than I would in live action. I would never want to see it in live action, but cartoon I think it would be fine. Especially because in the story when Luthien dances before Morgoth and his court and she puts them all to sleep by like singing and dancing for them so that she and Beren can steal one of the Silmarils, that would probably be really odd and really silly to watch in live action, but in anime it might actually be really beautiful and really emotional. So continuing on with the movie review, let's talk about some of the things that I really liked about this movie. So despite how little Tolkien actually wrote about this in the appendices, the movie takes great pains to quote him as often as it can, either taking that quote and putting it in dialogue or using it as a narrative quote when it's applicable. And from the get-go, this immediately gave me the confidence in the production because nothing was added or reworded that didn't have to be. Getting to hear Howard Shore's music instantly brought me back to Middle-earth. That was always going to be the case, and I really enjoyed the end credits song, The Rider. And while I thought it was a really good song, at the end of the movie, Hera is shown to be carrying Hama's lyre or his lute, and I thought it actually would have been really sweet if the song, instead of being about her, was instead a song that she wrote about her brothers and about her father as sort of an homage to them. And it also would have been a callback to something that Hama says in the movie where he remarks upon wanting great songs to be written about him potentially. But there are lines in the song paying homage to fallen warriors, saying things like, "Remember those and all who rode to battles lost and won." So I would have preferred it if it were more about Helm and Hama and Haleth, but I did like the song regardless. Helm Hammerhand was absolutely epic. It was really cool getting to see him do all of the awesome things that Tolkien does describe him doing. Every character in this movie has great standout hero moments, and they all get their own chance to shine, and they all shine in slightly different ways as according to the character. But Helm absolutely steals the show because he's just such a monster. Haleth and Hama are both just certified legends. Haleth is shown to be a good leader with very good warrior instincts, and he has no problem commanding troops, even though he's young. He's clearly been trained to be the leader after his father eventually dies. And Hama is also shown to be a very quick and strategic thinker, in addition to being a very good fighter in his own right, even if he's not as big or as strong as his older brother. And I was honestly afraid, like based on his character design and his voice actor, and the fact that he plays the lute or the harp or whatever it is, that he would be portrayed as like somehow like weak or incapable. But he has multiple very awesome moments, including being a great and very tactical shot with a bow. He takes down a mummic by killing the person that's riding it, so that's very cool. And he charges into melee in order to protect his father later, and he has this awesome moment where he just like bats an arrow out of the sky with his sword. And that was one of the scenes that looked rotoscoped to me. That's just an awesome scene. Not to mention how stoic and strong and collected he is in the face of death or potential capture. I mean, Hama was one of my favorite characters in this movie. I was, like most people, skeptical of Hera at the beginning of the movie. Mostly due to the trailer. But then I watched trailers that weren't released in America, and I felt slightly better about it. And then I actually watched the movie, and she grew on me. I thought she was a good character. She sounded like Éowyn, like in terms of her vocal quality, without actually like stealing any of Éowyn's character from her or like copying Éowyn's arc. Hera was sweet, she was vulnerable, and she had a very nurturing side. I enjoyed watching her. So Helm's last stand, obviously a very emotional moment in the movie, and they do it very well. We will talk about this more in depth in our Helm section, but my wife actually said that she started to get really like emotional during Helm's last stand because it reminded her of how much she loves her own father, who is fine, by the way, but it just had that emotional impact on her. And it really emotionally affected me too, because I realized that I will be thinking of this moment. I will be thinking of Helm's last stand. I will be thinking of this visual from now on whenever I go back and watch The Two Towers again and I see Aragorn and Gimli protecting the bridge so that they can fix the gate. I will remember Helm. And when Theoden says, "The horn of Helm Hammerhand shall sound in the deep," one last time, I will tear up even more than I usually do. And then when that company rides out to meet their enemies, I will cry even harder than last time. And then finally, when Éomer arrives and he says to the king, I will just be nothing but a pile of tears. And that is simply because the Battle of Helm's Deep and the Two Towers, or the Battle of the Hornburg as it's called in the books, is actually, it's always a very emotionally poignant moment for me when I watch those films. I always cry during it. But because of this movie, it will mean even more to me now. So I guess what I'm saying is that this movie, new Lord of the Rings movies, when they're done well and when they can legally connect themselves to Peter Jackson's other adaptations, new movies have the ability to make me see those original movies in a new and a fresh and very positive light. and that really excites me for the future, and it gives me hope for new Lord of the Rings adaptations, because that means that they are positively affecting the old films, not relying on the old films to make themselves good. So the voice acting was excellent, especially Brian Cox, who played Helm Hammerhand, Gaia Weiss, who voiced Hera, and I really liked Luke Pasqualino. I like a lot of his work. He voiced Wolf. So the dialogue was well written for the most part. There were like 1 or 2 lines where I was like, I don't feel like that belongs in a Tolkien movie. They weren't like modern. They were just kind of tropey, needlessly comedic or gimmicky. They didn't ruin the movie for me. There were just 1 or 2 of those, but everything else, the dialogue was very well written. It was simple and it was easy to understand, in contrast to the bloated and pretentious verbiage that the Rings of Power uses, because they think that's how Tolkien writes. How Tolkien writes is composed. It's elegant and somewhat higher than our usual speech, but it's not really that far removed. So I really liked how most of this movie was written. Cool tie-ins like how Helm Hammerhand and Hera use the secret passage to leave the Hornburg and go into the mountains, and then later the Rohirrim attempt to use that same passage to escape at the end of the film as Wolf is planning to launch his final attack. And I think that's probably the same passage that Gamling tells Aragorn about at the end of the Battle of the Hornburg and the Two Towers, and it's just a neat logical tie-in. Hera disarms Wolf by using a move with her shield at the very end, which I think is a nice touch. It's a good way for her to have won that fight without like physically overpowering him or doing it through skill. His sword just catches in her shield because it's wood, and she throws her shield away. So, very historical thing. I liked that. It was, of course, very nice to hear Sir Christopher Lee, all these years later, returning as Saruman. It's not a member berry. It's not out of place. It's not simply for the sake of like, oh, remember the original. Saruman is the literal last thing that Tolkien writes about in this section of the appendices. So he's supposed to be there. Tolkien says that he's there. His inclusion is done tastefully. It's not meant to just like cash in. Tolkien wrote about it. It's in there. And then finally, for Helm's death, they do play the Rohan funeral song sung in Rohirric, which is not only a respectful way to handle his death in the movie, it's not only tonally correct, but it's also a nice tie-in with Eowyn, who sings it during Theodred's burial in the extended version of the Two Towers. Though I do wish they had circled back around to Helm's death and like shown his burial mound at the end of the movie. I guarantee that that moment will appear if there is an extended version of the film. I'd be very surprised if it wasn't there. And then last but not least, the thing that I loved about this movie is at the very end, at the end of the credits, the entire film is dedicated to Bernard Hill, who of course played Theoden. Hail Theoden King. So now we'll talk about some of the things that I wasn't a fan of. I, of course, like most people, have things that I wish could have been done differently. Hera and Freylof's costume designs seemed much more fantasy anime than everybody else's costumes did. I think that for Hera, it might have been the white boots. If they had been brown and maybe just like a little bit shorter, I think that I might have bought them a little bit more. And I thought that Freylof's costume, like if he had had less contrast in his tunic, like in contrast to Helm or Haleth or Hama's garb, which seemed plausible. Like I could see what the different layers were. I could see what materials they were supposed to be made out of. Freylof's costume, I'm not entirely sure how it makes sense logistically, like how it physically could have been made with the materials and technologies that Rohan had. Hera's connection with the Eagles seemed random to me. The Watcher in the water was another thing that also seemed random to me. They didn't ruin the movie for me, but I was a little bit like, why is that supposed to be there? The tie-in with the orcs, of course played by Dom Monaghan and Billy Boyd, going through the dead on the battlefield trying to find the rings. It seemed, again, random to me, like maybe plausible that they would be doing that, but my biggest problem with this is how Gandalf somehow knew that that was happening, and then furthermore somehow knew that Hera had seen them and then wanted to talk to her at the end. It just seemed like a pretty weak tie-in and a pretty big stretch to try to tie that into the original films. Honestly, my biggest complaint with the movie is the character of Olwen, who is a made-up character for the movie. And my problem with her is quite simply that she should have died, like, multiple times. Not only because she, like, survived situations where she, like, just reasonably shouldn't have been able to survive them and it wasn't believable to me, but it also might have made the story more powerful had she died. I mean, in the movie, there's a point where Hera gets captured by Wolf, and then Freylof, who does get all of the credit for rescuing her, and Olwen, and another new character, Leaf, who is like a page boy, they go to rescue her, and at that moment, I genuinely feel like Olwen, she should have just died right there. Not because I hate her character, but just because it doesn't make sense that she lived. And then later in the movie, she's like fighting a whole bunch of people. all on her own. I mean, granted, they're coming at her essentially single file, so it's slightly more believable, and she does have a shield, but I think she also could have died there and had a last stand. I mean, like, she's way more of a girl boss than Hera is, and she is definitely a completely made-up character that had way too much authority given her station. I mean, she's supposed to be like a handmaid to Hera, and so historically, perhaps handmaidens might have been royal, but she like always was like bossing people around, and they were like just listening to her and following her orders as if she was like some sort of like commander. And I would have bought it more if they had just made her a commander instead and put her in armor, but I'm sure people would have been upset about that too. But I didn't know what her character was or why people were listening to her. And I think it would have been better at the end, like if she had died and like sacrificed herself trying to help with the escape, and then instead of her like giving her shield to Hera at the end, Hera actually just picks up that shield from her body, and like she has this moment where she recognizes that her essentially mother figure is dead, and she picks up the shield in order to defend herself. I think that would have been more emotionally impactful. Olwen was just like the weakest character in the movie for me. Personally, I wanted more from Hallis' death. This is not a lore complaint, it's just like a personal preference thing for me, because he does die in the movie the exact same way that Tolkien describes him dying at the gates of Edoras in the book. But I would have liked it if he had this very sort of anime, but also very Tolkien moment where he sort of like looks and his family is riding away and he like sort of sees them and they know that he's about to die and he knows that he's about to die, but he just sort of looks at them and he like smiles, this like closed eye and very like peaceful smile, letting them know that it's okay and that he's okay with it. And then he just like fights 40 guys and then they like turn around and they like see his silhouette backed by flame, like just sort of falling in the background. That's more what I was hoping to see from his death. He still died very bravely in the film in front of Medusel, just as Tolkien described. And so this isn't lore breaking that they didn't do it this way. That's just how I pictured Hallis dying. And so I'm sad that I didn't get to see it that way. I thought the siege tower that Wolf and the Dunlanding army makes is implausible, and they should have just made a regular siege tower. Although, to counter a point, a lot of people were saying, well, why didn't they just burn it while they were making it? And that's because they clearly show, while they're in the very beginning stages, one of the Rohirrim that's standing on the wall, the deeping wall, he looses an arrow at them and it lands very far short of his target, indicating that they're not actually building the siege tower within bowshot range. So that's the answer to that question. So to sum up the review, my final verdict, to put this in line with the other Lord of the Rings adaptations that we have, not just the Jackson films, not you, but yes, the cartoons from Mouth Action and Rankin Bass, I'd say that this movie, I agree with many people that the War of the Rohirrim sits firmly at about where The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey sits for me, which is my favorite of the Hobbit movies. It feels the most like The Return to Middle-earth. So I think it's very good, but I'm not sure that it deserves a place in a Peter Jackson marathon. And that's quite simply because it's an anime. And while I have made the case, and I do believe that it's true, that it being an anime does serve to help tell the story of Helm Hammerhand better than a live adaptation would have done, I think it's just so stylistically different from the live action movies that it would be weird to sort of watch it and then The Hobbit and then the original trilogy in some sort of chronological marathon, which I do quite often. I'm doing it for New Year's, actually. Like, I'm preparing to do it currently as I'm filming this video. And it's also, the story itself is so like self-contained that it doesn't, like, while I'll think about it when I'm watching The Two Towers, I don't have to watch it first because it's not really like a direct prequel to The Lord of the Rings. That being said, when I do a marathon of the cartoon Lord of the Rings movies, The Hobbit, Ralph Bakshi's The Lord of the Rings, and then The Return of the King by Rankin Bass, The War of the Rohirrim definitely deserves a spot there. And in my opinion, it is a very, very welcome addition to the cartoon adaptations of The Lord of the Rings, so it definitely deserves a spot in a cartoon marathon. And it will still have an emotional effect on me when I do go watch the live action films, mostly because of Helm Hammerhand, though I do anticipate that different people will find different things within this movie that resonate with them, and that they will be reminded of when they watch The Lord of the Rings. And that's kind of like the most positive thing here for me, is that this movie doesn't rely on the originals in order to make this movie good. This movie doesn't rely on Peter Jackson's other work like as a crutch, but it actually enhances the originals in a very positive way. It didn't make me want to rewatch the original trilogy because I was just reminded that they're so much better, or because I wished I was watching them instead, but rather it made me more excited for the next time that I watched the original trilogy because of the emotional impact of this movie specifically. I think that this movie is going to age incredibly well. It's caught in a hot culture war mess right now, which we're about to sort of get embroiled in ourselves, but I think in time people will appreciate this movie, especially if it follows the same trend of Jackson's other movies, which is that it's going to get an extended cut. I really hope that it does. I hadn't watched the theatrical release of the original Lord of the Rings trilogy for I haven't watched those for a very long time. I always watch the extended editions, but I was recently on a flight and United does happen to have the Lord of the Rings trilogy theatrical releases as part of their catalog. Which is a big reason to fly United. United does not sponsor this video. But the point being that I hadn't watched the theatrical releases in such a long time that I didn't realize that compared to the extended cuts, they don't make any sense. The pacing is completely off compared to the extended versions. There's far less character development. We're jumping all over the place. It's much harder to follow. The extended versions are so much better, and they clarify so much about the story that the theatrical cuts just don't do. So I fully anticipate that many of the gripes that I personally had with the War of the Rohirrim will be solved with an extended release. So I am overall very excited at the prospect of getting other Lord of the Rings anime adaptations, and if they keep on the theme, which I think that I'm seeing, which is where they do legends as animes, but more stories and histories as live action films, I think that animes could help support the original trilogy very, very nicely as their own sort of appendices, and build out the world and the breadth of Middle-earth even further without stepping on or encroaching upon the territory of the live action adaptations or coming into competition with them. So you now know what I think about this film. So yes, it's time to address all of the controversies. Because he is the star of the show, we will address Helm Hammerhand himself first. Do not be misled into thinking otherwise. Helm Hammerhand is the star of the story. This is Helm Hammerhand's story. Or rather, it is still about him. He is still the main subject of the legend as Tolkien describes. We see this legend through the eyes of his daughter, Hera. She does not steal the movie from him. She does not sideline him. I have seen some people say that they were afraid or think that she currently does sideline Helm in his own story. And I think that this is poor phrasing because the use of the word story here is too vague and it's misleading. It implies, purposefully or otherwise, that there is more to this story that Tolkien wrote that should have been in this movie that wasn't. And that's just simply not true because the legend of Helm Hammerhand exists. The story of Helm Hammerhand didn't exist until this movie. The appendices about him are a historical account only. They're not a story, they're not a short story, they're not even an unfinished short story. They are bullet points that say that Helm Hammerhand was there. This section in the appendices, chapter 2, appendices A, the House of Eorl, this portion about Helm Hammerhand exists only so much as to tell us that this character existed and to tell us what eventually led to his death, and thus Theoden eventually becoming king. This section is not written from Helm's perspective. He was never the POV character in the lore that Tolkien wrote. He is a pivotal character in Rohirrim history. That is a different thing. And I do not know if people saying that he has been sidelined in his own story know this, or what they were expecting this movie to be. Everything Tolkien says that Helm does in this movie. You can lament that they didn't make up more things for him to do so that he could be even more of the main character, but that would require the writers inventing things about Helm that Tolkien didn't write. In order to remain true, in order to remain objective, and without changing or adding things to Helm that Tolkien didn't write about him, which still probably would have upset fans if they had done that, the writers decided to keep Helm as he is in the original appendices. A legendary figure without too much detail that is just sort of seen from afar and through the lens of his enemies. And they still managed to flesh him out better and give him more character motivation than the actual appendices do. I am genuinely baffled at the idea that this movie should or even could have been about Helm solely as the main character. He dies halfway through the only thing written about him. I don't know what people were expecting. And I don't know if people that were expecting this movie to be solely about him know the lore that it's based off of. Like, I have seen 2 reviews from very large channels, very large viewerships, saying that this movie killed off Helm in the most idiotic and forced way possible, and they did it for the sole woke purpose of making way for Hera, the new woke female heroine. And this could just like simply not be further from the truth. I find it odd to criticize Helm's death in this movie as if it were made purely as this woke decision, when in reality, it's criticizing what Tolkien himself wrote without even realizing it. Helm's death is accurate to the lore. That is how Helm dies, as described by Tolkien in the book, essentially word for word as described by Miranda Otto when she narrates it. I mean, Helm was always going to die, and he had to die in that way. Frozen, knees unbent. Like, the only addition from the film for Helm's death is that in the film he dies to protect his daughter. And the only change about Helm's death in the movie is that he dies a quarter of a mile away. In the book, he dies on the dike, which is then renamed Helm's Dyke because that's where they find his body. And in the movie, he dies on the causeway right before the gate. Is the difference of 1,320 feet really the thing that breaks this film when everything else about his death is exactly the same? Like, for the record, Helm's Dyke is not mentioned or visually ever depicted in any of Jackson's depictions of Helm's Deep to begin with. So in terms of the movie OT canon, his death would have had less emotional effect there on the dike, as it's not a visual that we're familiar with, and they would have to introduce it for the first time for this movie. But seeing him die on the causeway is a visual that we're familiar with from the original trilogy, so therefore it has more emotional effect. Like, another complaint is that he should have just opened the gate all the way and gone in instead of talking to Hera. He should have just like saved himself, and that's why it was contrived. And you can see in the movie that he pushes that gate shut with so little time left before the attackers arrive that a sword actually gets stuck in between the doors as he pushes it shut. He would not have had enough time to open that gate enough for his massive frame to get through it and then close it again before the gate was breached by the people that were pursuing him. Is this moment contrived? Yes. A contrivance is when the writers create a scenario in order to have a predetermined outcome. Helm had to die. It is written. Like, his death is the predetermined outcome by Tolkien. It would be weird for him to save himself here, only to die later for a completely different reason under very similar circumstances. It would be a little bit like watching Luke Skywalker duel Kylo Ren in The Last Jedi, not to die during the duel with Kylo Ren, only to die a couple of seconds later for no reason at all. Of course Helm's death is contrived. It was the predetermined outcome that the writers were bound to by the lore. They took a death that is given no explanation in the lore, and they turned it into a needed sacrifice in order to save his daughter and his people in an incredibly awesome and powerful and based moment in this film with incredible visuals that also happens to end Helm Hammerhand's life exactly the way that Tolkien describes it. Frozen, dead as stone, knees unbent, a legend. It's not Hera's fault. She didn't kill him. Helm was always going to die in this way at this point in the story. I don't know how I can make this more clear. It boggles my mind because it seems that there are people complaining about his death that literally do not know that he dies, that thought that he was just supposed to live through the whole thing, I guess. The purpose of this part of the appendices is to explain that he dies. Like, they didn't kill him off. So how could you create a movie with Helm Hammerhand as the sole main character, the sole POV character, without making any new changes to the lore? Because that seems to be the big complaint here. The main line of attack against the War of the Rohirrim is, well, they should have just done what Tolkien wrote. As I've explained, that would take them 7 minutes to do, so they had to add and change stuff. But how would they do this? How would they make Helm the sole POV character without changing the lore? So I've come up with a couple different versions of alternate films featuring Helm Hammerhand as the main character, and none of them successfully solve the problem that they'd claim to solve, which is don't change the lore, just do what Tolkien wrote. Which again, I think is a deceptive thing to say because Tolkien only wrote 2 pages on the matter. And to say only do what Tolkien wrote implies that there is a story that Tolkien wrote that just wasn't told, and that isn't true. So we could have had a movie just about Helm, in which case the movie probably should have been called something like The Legend of Helm Hammerhand rather than The War of the Rohirrim, which already implies a much larger scope than just him. But so in order to make this movie like movie length, perhaps we could have started with Helm as a child, and we sort of go through his beginning years, maybe talk about his father Graham, who was the 8th king of Rohan, and then we watch as Helm, grows up, he's training, he fights in a couple battles, he eventually gets married, he has children, and then he becomes the king of Rohan, and then we see the War of the Rohirrim through his eyes in the latter half of the film. That sounds attractive, except for the fact that it requires the writers to make up way more stuff than they actually did for the version that we got, because Tolkien didn't write anything about Helm's childhood, so that's a whole bunch of made-up stuff right there. The whole point of including Helm's story in the appendices in the first place is simply to say that he was one of the only kings between Eorl the Young, the 1st king of Rohan, and Theoden, the 7th king of Rohan, that had anything written about him, which means that we don't know anything about his father Graham either, so aside from the fact that Graham also fought against the Dunlandings, so they have to make up a whole bunch of stuff about Graham in order to do Helm's backstory. And then there's the problem of Helm needing a wife or a consort or something in order for him to actually have children. Now, Tolkien doesn't say who that is or what happened to her or anything about her, so that's another made-up character that we have to have if we're going to do Helm's backstory. So anecdotally, I'll add that War of the Rohirrim had the chance to introduce the character of the mother, like just for the sake of having another female character in the movie, but Tolkien didn't write anything about her. So in the movie, she just straight up doesn't exist. I mean, like, obviously she existed at some point, otherwise, like, that you don't have the children. Like, you need a man and a woman in order to have kids. But since Tolkien doesn't ever mention her in any way at any point, she's not in the film. And this is simply explained by her dying shortly after Hera is born. Okay, so a movie like about the entire life story of Helm Hammerhand doesn't solve the problem of making additions to the lore. Even if it's what people would have preferred, it would still have to make changes to the lore. So what if we had a movie that was just much shorter? It was maybe 90 minutes instead of 2 hours and 15 minutes. And the first 15 to 20 minutes are just Helm being king, and then he kills Freka, just like he does in the book, just like he does in the movie. And then like the next 60 minutes of the film are just like Helm stalking the encampment of the Dunlandings and killing them. Just like a straight 60 minutes of blood and gore featuring Helm Hammerhand. That doesn't sound like a story that Tolkien would write. I mean, Tolkien is well known to have not liked writing about violence simply for the sake of violence. And his son Christopher's like biggest problem with the original trilogy was that it actually focused on the action too much. Tolkien dwells on the siege of the Hornburg and Helm's own like sorties so little that he doesn't describe any of the battles during the siege or how Helm Hammerhand fought the Dunlandings at all. In fact, he only says what other people believed about Helm, that the Dunlandings were afraid of him, and that he expends 4 sentences to explain this. He describes Helm killing Freka in more illicit detail than he does describe Helm killing the Dunlandings, because he doesn't describe Helm fighting the Dunlandings at all. We know that the Dunlandings were afraid of him, and we know that they cowered in fear when he blew his horn, that no one wanted to go near him, and they thought that he ate people. We have no idea if that's actually true, because it's mythic. To see it all from that first-person perspective would, by necessity, have to provide definitive answers to questions like that Tolkien himself left open-ended. It would rely on further creation of things that Tolkien didn't explicitly say, and it puts the focus on the violence when Tolkien himself didn't actually do that. I never expected this to be the movie. So my wife suggested that perhaps if this were a smaller and self-contained story with less additions and like a longer running show with more episodes called something like The Tales of Middle-earth, that would have worked as well. If we had like many episodes, just one of them was like the story of Helm Hammerhand, that could have worked too. And I've seen some other Lord of the Rings creators suggest this as well. So it seems like a common enough idea. But my response to this is that while it would have worked, I don't believe that doing it this way would have had enough time to create the emotional effect that we needed in order for this to be like a true story. If this had been just like a 20 to 30 minute short combined with other 20 to 30 minute shorts from the appendices, the episodes would have been just that, appendices. You might as well just like include them at the end of the Return of the King in a box set so you can like watch them once if you're interested and then never again. They would exist solely so much as to say this other stuff happened. But that's not a story. The emotional relatability would have been greatly diminished. The rewatchability of it as a film would have been greatly diminished. It would sort of beg the question even more, why even bother? So the absolute best that I can come up with is that there could have been a version where we're shown what's happening to Helm at the Hornburg, and we're shown what is happening to Freylof at Dunharrow at the same time, and we cut back and forth between the story of the old king and the story of the new king, and then we end with the new king. So it's not just Helm that's the POV, it's Helm and Freyalaf. And honestly, we could still have that. I mean, you could add Freyalaf's story onto the movie that we got. It would be a much longer movie, but you wouldn't have to change anything else. You could just add more of Freyalaf, and I would have really enjoyed that. I hope that we get more of Freyalaf in the extended edition. I mean, I seem to be in the minority of people that thought that this movie was too short, and I really wanted more. Imagine going to a Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movie and thinking to yourself that it's too long, but this still doesn't solve the problem because we don't know what Freyalaf was doing during the war. Tolkien didn't write anything about it. We only know that he wasn't with Helm and that he came out of Dunharrow at the end of the war and then he finished it. Freyalaf had to be there at the beginning of the film because he couldn't just show up at the end with no explanation as to who he was or how he was related to anybody like he does in the historical account, but then he had to leave because Tolkien said only that he came out of Dunharrow. So no matter what, you run into the problem of having to add something that Tolkien didn't expressly write. So do you add Freyalaf into the Siege of the Hornburg in order to make him more part of the story than what Tolkien said he was, just to have him be a POV character? Or do you make up things about him being a Dunharrow in order to say what he was doing there without having it be boring, even though Tolkien didn't write anything about it? Making Freyalaf a POV character also doesn't solve the problem of Helm has a daughter. She has to be there. She has to react to what happens. It would be weird if she didn't. Like, were people really expecting that we were gonna get a version of this movie where it's just like Helm Hammerhand being the king and beating people to death and doing awesome manly stuff, and then the camera just like sort of pans over to Hera for 2 seconds, so she just sort of vaguely waves at him, and then we never see her or hear from her again like in the appendices? Like, are we for some reason under the impression that if Tolkien had actually written this out as a full story, that he wouldn't have expounded upon her character or even given her a name? Helm's daughter is sure to have thoughts and feelings and connections with her family, right? Surely she must have had some sort of reaction when her entire family died. It isn't for pandering, it isn't for an agenda, it's very simple math. This story has 7 characters. There's Helm, there's Freka, there's Wolf, there's Haleth, Hama, Helm's daughter, and Freyalaf. And halfway through the story, 4 of those characters are dead. One of the characters that's alive, Wolf, is the villain, and he also dies, leaving only 2 characters, Freyalaf and Helm's unnamed daughter. They're the only characters which are there at the beginning and the end of the story. You can't add more to Freyalaf without adding more to the story or changing what Tolkien wrote, because he doesn't come in until the very end. Having Hera be the eyes through which we see Helm's story is kind of the only thing that makes sense. She solves all of the problems. We know she had to be there. She was the catalyst that started the entire war in the first place. Tolkien says so, but she's also a perfectly blank slate. She's the only character that's there from start to finish, doesn't die, and can be added to without changing a whole bunch of other stuff. Like, she's the only logical choice for a POV character from a narrative perspective. It's the only way to avoid having to constantly switch POV characters 1/3, 1/2, or even 75% of the way through the film, in a film that people were already complaining is too long to begin with. I'm sorry, I can't be the only one that read the lore and went, wait, so what happened to his daughter then, right? Right? So how do you write an entire movie that includes a character that's there from start to finish, doesn't have a name or a personality, doesn't die, doesn't become the queen despite being the sole surviving heir to the throne with a direct bloodline lineage to the previous king, and doesn't get married and have any children? You can't. You don't. You couldn't reasonably expect anybody to write that story. Helm's daughter is part of the story. She's the entire reason that the entire thing happens. It's obvious to assume that in order to include her, you're gonna have to write dialogue for her. You're going to have to make her a character. You're going to have to give her a name, have a personality, the same way that you would expect them to develop Haleth and Hama, Helm's other 2 children, which the movie does, because they also aren't described in any meaningful sense. They also don't have any dialogue, and they're also both mentioned in a single sentence each, and both of those sentences simply say, and they died. Well, the solution for this film is to simply have a young woman that is essentially Arya Stark. The worst and fairest criticism that I can think of for this is that it's a trope that I've seen before and I'm tired of it. Spirited princess doesn't want to get married. But in order for her to exist, which we have very well established that she must, because Tolkien said she was there, without stepping on the toes of Freyalaf, who does become the king and is 7 times Theoden's grandfather, this is a case where the trope is necessary in order to benefit the story and avoid stepping on the lore. And I've seen people say that they're upset that she doesn't have an arc and that she doesn't grow. But when you take into account the fact that they needed to create a character for her so they could write the story, but they ultimately can't have her affect or change the lore at all because she isn't written about, I struggle to think of a way to like really make her change or do anything that doesn't result in like drastically changing the lore. Like, she has as much of an arc as possible without causing dramatic or any ripples to the canon. Like, she goes from being a girl that is scared and has always had her father there to protect her and look after her and take care of her problems, to a woman who is shown to be capable of leading her people and is able to put their needs before hers. And despite clearly not wanting to or expecting to have that power because she's the third child, and she was planning to be married off to another country, she takes up that leadership position after her father asks her to do it because there's nobody left. Her arc is very closely tied with Helm's arc. In the beginning of the film, it was clear to me at least that she thinks that maybe her father doesn't love her, because they have this conversation right before the battle at Edoras where he tells her that it would please him if she were married off and he didn't see her again. But at the end of Helm's arc, when he sacrifices himself during his legendary last stand in order to protect her, it makes it even more emotional because he tells her that he does love her and that he is proud of her, which, like, what daughter wouldn't want to hear her very strong and based father tell that to her? Like, underneath his rough warrior exterior, he loves his kid. Like, there's nothing woke about that. Hera doesn't die. Although that also would have been a solution to the conundrum of, like, why isn't her character written about any further, but it would have given her death a direct date to kill her in the movie, which Tolkien does not do in the lore. Therefore, they didn't change it. They didn't kill her off. So why doesn't she become the queen instead of Freylof? Tolkien doesn't explain this. And no, it's not because the Rohirrim must always be led by a man because they're a patriarchal society. I've seen some people say that. That is obviously not true. This is evidently untrue because Theoden expressly tells Éowyn on multiple occasions that if he and Éomer should die, that she must survive in order to lead the people of Rohan. In the books, right before the Battle of Helm's Deep, when Theoden asks his court what man would volunteer to stay behind in order to lead if he and Éomer should not return from the Hornburg, there's no men that volunteer. And he has essentially asked his people to vote for their new leader should he and his heir die, indicating that in times of need, the kings of Rohan can be chosen by popular vote, and it's not always by direct lineage. However, another character, named Hama, says that the people believe in the House of Eorl, implying that even if it isn't legally always about bloodline lineage, that the people traditionally trust in that bloodline and would prefer it to lead them when possible. And then he immediately states that Éomer doesn't have to stay behind for this because there is Éowyn, daughter of Éomund, his sister. She is fearless and high-hearted, all of the people love her, let her be as lord to the Eorlingas while we are gone. And then Theoden says immediately, without a fight, it shall be so. And this echoes another story from earlier in the First Age, where another character, a woman named Haleth, becomes the chieftain of the Halidin after her father and brother are killed. So here we have two examples of human women in Middle-earth taking over as leaders of their people after their male family members have died. The case for Éowyn is made by a character named Hama, the same name as Helm's younger son and Hera's brother. The other character, the chieftain of the Halidin, named Haleth, who eventually goes on to found the House of Haleth, shares the same name as Helm's other son. Are we starting to maybe see the threads that may have led them to make this decision? So it's clearly not a question of sex or of gender roles, as Éowyn and Haleth clearly prove. So then why doesn't Hera become the queen? And how do you make Freylof the king without creating conflict for the throne of Rohan between him and Hera, which Tolkien never wrote about? Well, the simple solution is she doesn't want the throne. You can say that it's a tired trope, you can say that you've seen it before and it's boring, but that's how it has to be. It's the only way, because that's what Tolkien wrote. If Freylof saying it should have been you at the end of the movie isn't any sort of like political messaging or lessening of his accomplishment of becoming the king, it's a genuine logical question that anyone watching the movie is going to have. If Hera is Helm's daughter, which she is, and she isn't dead, which she isn't, then why isn't she the queen? She doesn't admonish Freylof or say that you're right, it should have been me, or lament that it's the patriarchal nature of the Rohirrim keeping her from power. She simply says, it was never mine to wear. Which it wasn't, because she was the third child. Like, she was like never going to become the queen in the first place. Like, that is the least girl boss thing that I can possibly think of her saying. And it correctly leaves all of the pieces on the board exactly in the places that Tolkien said they were at the end of the war without creating conflict. It was Freylof who was the hero. He arrived and saved Rohan. Of course the people made him king. The movie didn't say that they offered it to Hera first and then she declined just because she's like a childish brat and that's the only reason Freylof became king, because he like just got handed the bone at the end of the movie. I didn't see it as her shirking her duty or being childish. And even if that is a complaint that I know that some people have, then like it would seem to indicate that the solution that you're looking for is that in order to not shirk her duty, she should have become queen, even though that's not what Tolkien wrote. It seems a little bit like putting the writers in a catch-22, where like they're faithful to the lore and she doesn't become the queen, and that's poor writing. But if they change it and then she actually is the queen, it's also changed the lore and they get nailed for that too. So like, what would have made people happy in this regard? Like, you could choose to interpret it as her not becoming queen is like a shirking of her duty and it ruins her character arc, and that she's being childish, but I didn't interpret it that way. That's not what I got from the movie. What I got was that she was the third in line, she was never going to become the queen, she was about to be married off to someone in Gondor, and then she had to take a stand because everybody else was dead, and then all of a sudden Freylof came in, and she was like, great, my people will be safe. They have Freylof, and I do not have to bear the burden that I never wanted to or was prepared to bear in the first place. I have played my part, and now I'm free to go. Because when the men go to war, the women have to pick up the pieces, but when the men return, the women no longer bear the burden of leadership. It's a reoccurring theme throughout history and throughout Tolkien, and it makes perfect sense to tell that story here because that's the story that the lore tells. The only surviving witness to the entirety of the events is an unnamed woman. Men fight to gain land, resources, power, renown, glory, protect their country, kingdom, honor, and their people and their families. But when push comes to shove, and there's nobody left, women will fight to protect their families and their homes. And that's how it's supposed to be. A male grizzly may attack you simply for encroaching on its territory or because it wants to, but a mama bear will do the same if you get near her cubs. By the end of the movie, there is nobody left until Freylof arrives, and then they immediately make him king, because of course they do. Like, this is a theme that is so backed up by everything in this movie. The inclusion, or rather the allusion to the Shield Maidens, this story of a group of women who banded together to fight back against the Easterlings because there was no one else left to protect them, and they had to protect their homes. It's a true story that is talked about in the Unfinished Tales that was posthumously published by Christopher Tolkien. It's something real that happened within Middle-earth. It's not some woke invention, and while Tolkien didn't explicitly refer to those women as Shield Maidens, we know that the term Shield Maidens at least exists in concept in Tolkien canon, as Aragorn does call Eowyn one, and we also know that Shield Maidens as a group or a title is something that exists in Anglo-Saxon and Norse mythology, so it's clearly something that Tolkien would have been aware of. Their inclusion does not dominate or commandeer the story. They are included only so much as to tell us that they existed, which is exactly what Tolkien does. And the lyrics for the credits song, The Rider, which is chocked full of very well done references to Tolkien, if you doubt the dedication and love for Tolkien by the people that made this film, the lyrics for the song ask, in need, who will come when the last line is broken? Men are always the last line of defense. Helm Hammerhand, like the quintessential man, is the last line of defense, but he dies well before the war is over. There is so much evidence that this is the intended theme, and there is great cause for it to be. So much beautiful imagery in this film supports this. Hera sending her two brothers off to war, standing alone at the gate, and watching them as they ride away. It's a beautiful moment. The women and the children are obviously all huddling together. Women have watched for centuries as men that they love have gone off and then been destroyed by war. And Hera has watched her entire family, all of the men that she cared about, die in defense of her and of her country. And the last line by the end of the story is broken until Freylof comes back to restore order at the end. But what happens in between? The story doesn't just end with Helm Hammerhand's death. Who's left? Hera, who has suffered every loss. She appears not in armor, not commanding an army, but as a lone woman in a wedding dress, the embodiment of maidenhood and femininity, with no man there to defend her, vulnerable, and a vision of the sorrows that the wrath of war wreaks upon a nation, yet choosing to hope, or at least to fight, rather than to just give up to despair and fear. It is so clear to me that this is a very Tolkien sentiment, that this is the story that the movie has intended to tell, not because of any ideology, but because it fits neatly within the lore itself. You look at the lore in the appendices, and it's not a story in and of itself. It's just a series of events happening. But what story does the lore tell? This one. It could tell other ones too, but it does tell this one. And it makes so much sense to me from an adaptive standpoint to tell this story, to take the lore written about a war where the lone surviving witness is an unnamed woman forgotten by the annals of history, to take that lore and tell that story from the perspective of that woman. Added to this, and my wife is actually the one that pointed this out, that Hera's deeds in the movie as they're presented in the film, no one's there to witness them. She is always alone if she does something heroic, like killing the Mumakil or dueling Wolf himself. There are no meaningful witnesses that claim allegiance to Rohan that actually credit her with any of these feats. In fact, Leif is the only one that knows that she's the one that's staying behind at the end so that everyone else can escape. And he doesn't credit Hera, he credits the Shield Maidens, the idea of the Shield Maidens, because it's about inspiring hope. It's not about Hera. No one knows that she did anything except for her, which explains perfectly why she was there, allows her to be a character, and then avoids impeding on any of the lore that Tolkien actually did right. The only person that knows that she did anything is her, and Olwen, who leaves with her and doesn't tell anybody. I've already been over Olwen. She's the weakest link in the film. So now I will continue to ruffle feathers, I guess, by countering some of the other common complaints I have seen against Hera being in this movie. The first one being that Hera is a completely made-up character, that she's Galadriel 2.0 from the Rings of Power, that is just like blatantly false. Tolkien says that Helm has a daughter. We've established already many times that she had to be in this movie. Hera is also different from Galadriel in the Rings of Power. The problem with Galadriel, or at least my problem with Galadriel in the Rings of Power, isn't that she was a woman or that she was strong or that she was the main character and a strong woman. It's that Galadriel is an extensively written about character in the lore. We know a lot about her, we know a lot about what she did and when she did it and why and where, and the Rings of Power decided to ignore all of that just to tell their own story and make up their own character and then just name her Galadriel. And our response collectively as a fandom was, don't do that. Just create your own character then. And Hera was described so little in the actual lore itself that she isn't even given a name. So they wrote her a character drawing clues from what we know about the culture of the Rohirrim and how the story had to end. They didn't change or move any of the other pieces on the board in order to accommodate her. They did exactly what the Tolkien fanbase was saying they should have done with the Rings of Power, and people are still upset about it. And in this light, Hera is actually a less problematic addition than Tauriel was in The Hobbit, because that was a character manufactured out of whole cloth. But again, there's context, there is nuance, because my problem wasn't with Tauriel existing. I liked the character of Tauriel, and I like Evangeline Lilly. She's based. The problem was that Tauriel didn't belong in The Hobbit. But if Tauriel were to come back for the hunt for Gollum, that would be perfectly anticipated and very reasonable for them to do. It makes perfect sense. Hera is an even less manufactured character than Alfred was from The Hobbit, and Alfred was way more annoying than Hera is. Nothing against Ryan Gage, who played him. I like him a lot too. But the point being that they took a character that had nothing written about her, that was actually a blank slate, and then wrote her a character because they had to, based off of the lore that they had available to them about the Rohirrim, and they did it in a very logical way. It's not the same as Galadriel, and it's not the same thing as just creating a brand new character out of nothing. The second complaint is that Hera is a girl boss, because the women in Rohan were not allowed to fight. Tolkien doesn't say that ever at any point. When Hera does fight, she doesn't always win. In fact, she quite frequently loses and is overpowered by everybody. And if she wins, it's never due to just her brute strength or her mastery or her skill or anything like that. It's generally because she has help, because she's lucky, and it's due to her clever thinking. I mean, that's a very feminine way of writing a character, is that a woman's power comes from her cunning. She is not Xena the Warrior Princess. She is not Galadriel from the Rings of Power. She is not a girl boss. She's just a girl who shows emotion and has flaws and has weaknesses and makes mistakes and needs her father and loves her brothers. She's just a girl. Yes, she knows how to ride a horse and use a sword. She's the daughter of a great war king in a land of warrior horse lords. Like, of course she knows how to fight and ride, just like Éowyn did. Now, in response to this, in comparison to Éowyn, I of course seen some people say that, well, people often forget that Éowyn had to dress like a man in order to join the Rohirrim, and that definitively proves that only men are allowed to fight in Rohan. And that is just not true. It's not true because it avoids context. What people in this case are forgetting is that Éowyn was expressly forbade from fighting by her uncle, the king. Not just because she's a woman, but also because she's the heir to the throne if Theoden and Éomer die, which they fully intend to do when they go on an extended war campaign to Gondor. Hera having to fight for her life because she's trapped in a dead end and has no choice and is there is not the same thing as Éowyn sneaking into an army encampment and then traveling for days and weeks worth of journey on a war campaign. Éowyn's disguise is as much to hide the fact that she is Éowyn, Éomen's daughter, as it is to hide the fact that she is a woman, probably even more so. And for further evidence, I point you towards a deleted scene from The Two Towers as directed by Peter Jackson, where orcs break into the caves under Helm's Deep and Éowyn picks up a sword and fights in order to defend her people as they're trying to escape. They cut this, both for time and also because they didn't want to overly foreshadow her later battle with the Witch King of Angmar. But she didn't dress up as a man for this scene, and I highly doubt that if they had kept it, we would have later seen Theoden say, well, you shouldn't have protected our people like that because you're a woman. Her dressing up was completely circumstantial and contextual to her being the heir to the throne. And as Tolkien writes, it's honestly really lucky that she was there at the Battle of Pelennor Fields because she ends up doing a great deed. She protects her uncle. She literally does this. She's honestly a better fighter than Hera is, so this really isn't like the argument against Hera being a girl boss that some people seem to think that it is, and I know that there may be some people that are tempted to call me a smooth brain because, well, Éowyn had help from Merry when she was killing the Witch King of Angmar. That's true. Hera also had a lot of help when she was fighting all of her battles, and Éowyn didn't need help to do this. Now, did she? And don't even get me started on, well, Hera killed the Frost Troll because she had to steal the glory from Helm Hammerhand because of feminism. It's framing. It's subjective perspective. Please stop it. You are choosing to look at it that way. Fighting it with his bare fists was clearly not working because it's a very large and armored creature, so she did what Merry and Pippin are shown to do throughout the books and throughout the movies, where she created an opening and then Helm finished it off with a rock. Like, what was she supposed to do? Nothing? And that moment is even foreshadowed in the movie with the moment in The Watcher in the Water where she's shown to already be a good shot with a javelin. Like, I have no problem with this. The problem was never having strong, capable women in Middle-earth. There are so many of them. The problem in this case isn't even inventing characters out of whole cloth. We've established that Helm had a daughter and that she had to be in this movie. The problem very specifically when it comes to rewriting characters in Tolkien is rewriting them, is taking a character like Galadriel and making her a character that isn't Galadriel. They did not do that with this movie. And you know that it's particularly weak argument when you have people on both sides of the aisle. You have people on the left and people on the right making the exact same arguments, but for different reasons. Like, you have people on the left saying, well, Tolkien is very sexist because it doesn't pass the Bechdel test or there's not enough female characters, but then you also have people also on the left saying, well, Tolkien is actually full of female characters and it's very good that we're getting more of them because it's true to what Tolkien wrote. And then you have people on the right saying the exact same things, but for completely opposite reasons, saying that, well, Tolkien didn't write enough female characters, so therefore having a main female character isn't true to Tolkien. And then you have other people on the right saying, well, actually there are strong female characters in Tolkien, we just don't like Galadriel and we don't like Hera for whatever reason, but Éowyn is completely fine. You can't call this movie woke without complaining about Éowyn at the exact same time. Is it possible, or at least conceivable, that both sides are wrong and that there are strong female characters in Tolkien and that it's perfectly fine to have strong female characters in Tolkien and that it's not political either? A third complaint which I've seen crop up, and a lot of people are repeating it, which is that Hera is a Greek name. They named her after the Greek goddess, and it's an insult to Tolkien because why wouldn't they name her something Anglo-Saxon? And this seems to me like something that was maybe noticed by someone who had like a passing or cursory knowledge of Greek history, like enough to make this comment, but like didn't do enough research in order to actually verify the claim, and then people just like repeated it because they wanted to have something to say about this movie. Well, Philippa Boyens does have something to say about this. I've seen people complain about Philippa Boyens too, as if they didn't know who she was. I've seen people claim that all of the writers for this movie are just woke DEI hires that weren't hired for their skill, which would imply that they don't know who Philippa Boyens is. She is one of the original creators. She and Fran Walsh worked together to create this character of Hera and name her. Fran Walsh is Peter Jackson's wife, if you're not familiar. So they came up with the name for this character, and Philippa Boyens has said explicitly on interview, on record, they did not name Hera after the Greek goddess Hera. And that is because Hera is actually not the name of the character. It is pronounced Hera. It is done with an Anglo-Saxon spelling, it is done with an Anglo-Saxon pronunciation, and the goal here was very obviously to try to maintain the alliterative nature of family names in Tolkien. You have Helm, you have Hama, you have Haleth, and you have Hera. Presumably Hild was off the table because Hild is already the name of a character in the story. Hild is Freylof's mother, so to name another character Hild would be kind of bizarre, and I suppose they could have named her another H name that sounded more Anglo-Saxon to some people, like Helga or something, but at what point are we just nitpicking for the sake of having something to complain about? It is an Anglo-Saxon pronunciation, it is an Anglo-Saxon spelling, and it is an Anglo-Saxon word. It means obedient, or one who obeys, and it is also an old Frisian word meaning lord. If you're not aware, Frisians used to live in what is now North Holland and the Netherlands, so really, really early Vikings, like the Rohirrim are supposed to be. So While Hera is not directly a name that is found in Anglo-Saxon history, it does have Anglo-Saxon roots, it has an Anglo-Saxon spelling, it has an Anglo-Saxon definition, and it has an Anglo-Saxon pronunciation. So in addition to all of that, it is an attempt to honor the alliterative nature of names and is clearly not an insult to Tolkien. Another complaint I have seen is that Hera's powers are never explained. This is going along with the Girlboss thing, and that she doesn't get a training sequence, and therefore she is a broken and overpowered and poorly written character. My response to this is that, well, Rey gets training sequences multiple times throughout the new Star Wars movies, and she's still a Mary Sue. So a training sequence is not the difference between a well-written character and a poorly written character. In fact, training sequences shouldn't ever be used solely to show how a person got or understood their powers. Training sequences exist to show a character's resolve, to show character development, determination, grit, or develop a student and teacher relationship. Training sequences exist to further the plot, not to explain skills. When they are written simply to explain skills, it's a writing crutch, and it's a very poor one at that. That being said, Hera actually is shown training as a child in the movie, very, very briefly. It's very easy for me to assume that she was either taught her skills by her father or by her brothers or whoever trained her brothers, who was presumably her father. I don't need to see this happening in order for me to believe that it happened. It would be a complete waste of time to try to explain this and delve into a very tired trope of what are essentially prequel films just filling themselves with answers to useless questions that nobody asked, like, well, how did a girl from a nation of warrior horse lords learn how to ride a horse and be a warrior? And this is clearly explained in the prologue, where it says that she was raised beside two brothers by a warrior king. She could ride a horse before she could walk. The implication obviously being because her dad raised her that way along with their brothers. And from that, we would also be able to assume that her brothers could also ride horses before they could walk too, just like she did. So again, it's not just like a woke thing that's specific to her. We would reasonably assume most people in the Rohirrim to learn how to ride a horse before they could walk. It's a true statement because it's a realm of warrior horse lords. I've seen people complain about this too. She's a great rider because she's smaller than everybody else. It's not because she's a woman and they had to make her better than all of the men. It's because, like, you think that putting a 110-pound woman on a war horse and then having her raced against a 230-pound man in armor on the same sized war horse is going to be fair to the man? There is a reason that jockeys are so small. It's because small equals light, and light equals faster horse. It's very simple, it's not woke. And then lastly, the final complaint is in regards to a piece of dialogue, and I just simply want to address this. The dialogue being at the very end, right before she duels Wolf, he says, well, to whom are you promised? And she replies, death. And so I think some people have actually interpreted this literally, as if it was intended as some sort of threat of death against Wolf. And I think it was the Broken Sword who suggested, and this is nothing against him because I really liked his review, Broken Sword, you're a cool guy. But he pointed out that perhaps it would have sounded better if she had simply replied that she is the bride of Rohan, or that she is married to Rohan. And this might have made sense if Hera were intending to live and survive the encounter. But I didn't interpret it this way. I saw it as she is using death the way that we usually see death invoked by the Rohirrim, which is that she is saying that she is bound for and destined for death, and she is invoking it before she goes to it. And that directly answers the setup, because he says, to whom are you promised, and not to who are you betrothed? So it's a more existential question than the literal interpretation of an actual marriage. He says, to whom are you promised? And the response is that she's promised to death, which implies to me that she is planning on dying. She's wearing a dress that was meant to be worn by another Rohirric woman who also died before she was married, just like Hera is planning to do. So we come to it at last, the great battle of this video. Man, people are gonna be so upset at me. Is this movie woke? No. The War of the Rohirrim did not exhibit, force feed, or otherwise insert any modern political agendas. It didn't make me feel wrong or bad or stupid for being a man. It didn't insert racial or gender ideology into any part of the film. It did not rewrite history in an attempt to make heroes seem like they're actually villains or destroy or character assassinate fan favorites. Like, this movie is not woke. I actually detest the word woke, not because I necessarily disagree that modern Hollywood movies tend towards pushing left-wing political narratives in their movies, and I don't want that to happen, but rather because the term woke is useless. It's a buzzword, and it means absolutely nothing, and it's not a useful or meaningful way of criticizing a piece of media, even if it's correct. And in this case, it isn't, which I will prove momentarily, but woke has almost become synonymous with bad for reviewers and audiences alike. Like, if something isn't woke, then it's good. and if something is woke, then it's bad. And this is a very poor way of analyzing something because woke lacks a definition. Something can be woke and good, or it can be just good and not woke, or it can be woke and bad, or it can just simply be bad. And adding woke to the equation overcomplicates the conversation while simultaneously diluting the substance of it, because it would be much simpler to say things can either be good or bad and then just move on. Calling something woke is rather a way to label something so that people can then attack that label rather than actually having a conversation about the thing itself. It is a way to preach to the choir, so it's not helpful inherently. Some choirs like to be preached to. There will inevitably be people who say that I'm backpedaling or selling out or shilling as if liking the War of the Rohirrim somehow undoes the fact that I dislike the Rings of Power. Like, this is what creates an echo chamber. I am never going to attack something simply because I am expected to or it's trendy to do so. The Lord of the Rings is not a weapon to be wielded against my enemies. That is why I made my Rings of Power critiques, because above all else, they sought to wield the Lord of the Rings as a weapon against me, against us, against the fans. This movie didn't politicize itself. The media didn't politicize this movie. The media barely marketed this movie to begin with, let alone politicize it. There are people currently in the mainstream media right now who were just praising the Rings of Power when it came out and attacking the fans when it came out, now attacking the War of the Rohirrim as if they suddenly care about the lore and about cash grabs and about integrity. The question is, why now? Especially when this time the critiques don't even apply. Setting aside the fact that this movie is incredibly faithful to the lore, as I have already proven, you should be incredibly skeptical of articles like this. These people were just attacking us 2 years ago over our identical but much more valid complaints about the Rings of Power. They haven't come around, they haven't changed their minds or seen the light, and as we've established, they aren't stupid either. They were trying to sow division on purpose. So they aren't suddenly our allies just because now they're critiquing something that other members of the fandom happen to be critiquing currently. They agree with the political messaging of the Rings of Power. They then have a vested interest in tanking any attempts at future Lord of the Rings adaptations from competitors that aren't political because they are a threat to the message. Of course, these leftist outlets are going to be attacking this movie and trying to tear it down. Obviously, these media outlets are currently, with one hand, attacking Peter Jackson's own new movie as being nothing more than a cynical cash grab, and with the other hand, are seeking to positively compare the Rings of Power to Jackson's old movies in order to try and get more people to watch it. There would be nothing more positive for the woke agenda than having Peter Jackson and his entire legacy, starting with this movie, just be completely removed and forgotten from the cultural zeitgeist. And bafflingly, some of us are attacking it too and pointing to the very people that were just our enemies 2 seconds ago as evidence now about how right we are. We'll see even The Guardian is on my side. That proves how bad this movie is and that it's a cynical cash grab. I can't believe I'm siding with The Guardian. This is ridiculous and it lacks foresight. You have it backwards. Your enemies didn't just suddenly become your allies because they realized that you were right. You misidentified your allies in your zealousness for war and now find yourself fighting on the same side as your enemies. They didn't switch sides, you committed an act of friendly fire, and it's as infuriating to watch as it is unhelpful. Now, the cynical take in the media and among commentators alike is that Warner Brothers only made this movie to retain the rights to the original IP, and it's just a cash grab. And if this were the case, then I'd still say, fine, great even. Because what? You want the rights up for sale? You want Amazon to be able to buy the rights and have dominion over all of it? Or worse yet, Disney? If it's true that this movie had to be made in order for Warner Brothers and New Line Cinema to retain control over Jackson's adaptations and of The Lord of the Rings and of the movie rights as a whole, then it's also true that this movie had to be made in order to protect the Tolkien fandom and the Tolkien estate from Amazon or another much more damaging entity. Why attack Warner Brothers for this? This isn't an own. They're attempting to save a story that you love. We should be encouraging them and showing them love and support, showing them that there is an audience for non-political films so that they feel monetarily safe and confident in making them without feeling the need to pander. If we tank this film on purpose and then they start pandering harder with The Lord of the Rings afterwards, we will only have ourselves to blame. It is cutting off your ear to spite your face. Rings of Power has taken the L once again. The War of the Rohirrim is like the final nail in the coffin, and it concerns me greatly that some of us don't see the War of the Rohirrim as the win that it is, but rather claim it as a loss and then claim our ability to complain about losing as a win. The tactics of this make no sense to me. In fact, ask yourself, as was the case with the Rings of Power, where are the articles calling fans racist, sexist, or toxic if they don't like the War of the Rohirrim? They don't exist. Where are those articles? Why don't those articles exist if this movie is woke? Well, the answer is that there isn't an agenda with this film. It isn't woke, and as such, it is not worth it for the left to defend this film. And just to illustrate my point, let's imagine if it had. So feel free to laugh along. If this movie were to be woke, in order for me to want to call it woke, as much as I've already stated that I dislike the term and find it distasteful in an analytical context, this is what I would have anticipated the movie to have included or the plot to be. I would have expected to have a completely multicultural Rohirrim with Asian, Latin American, and African members of the Rohirrim. Hera would have probably bested everybody in single combat, including her brothers and probably even her father. The Shield Maidens would have been explained to be an entire elite force of all-female warriors who had always existed and were always as good as, if not better than, all of the men, and they were their own completely self-sufficient society that was better than Rohan, and that they didn't need men, kind of like the Amazons, and they excluded all of the men on purpose, and it was only because of the patriarchy that they became disbanded. Hera would have had, and you'll notice that I'm saying Hera for the woke version because they would have just named her after the Greek goddess, unlike the movie that we got. Hera would have had these very long speeches saying how that she's always been ignored because she's a woman, and says that men are bad and make you feel bad for being a man, and that men are stupid, and how she needs to be recognized and applauded for all of her accomplishments. Hera would then poach lines and dialogue from other characters in the original trilogy and say them first, as to both be a member berry referencing the original trilogy, and then also say that the original character is actually not as good as her because chronologically they're now just copying her brilliance. I would anticipate that there would be some sort of exploration about how Rohan is actually an evil oppressor or a colonizer, and the Dunlandings were actually just a totally normal and peaceful people that had to fight against the Rohirrim because they were actually maybe the bad guys all along. And then we would insert some sort of obligatory allegory asking, well, actually, is Helm Hammerhand just Trump? And then we would give elements of Helm or Haleth or Hamma's story or lines over to Hera, or otherwise say that none of their accomplishments, as was dictated by the lore, either happened to begin with, or if they did happen, they actually all just belonged to her. For example, in this woke version of the movie, perhaps Helm actually didn't go out every night and take on the Dunlanding army single-handedly. He actually just died, or was too old and weak and feeble and broken, and it was actually Hera who went out every night and killed the Dunlandings dressed in his armor or something, and they all thought it was him, but she's the one that created the legend, and it was actually all her all along. And then at the end of the movie, when all of the Rohirrim arrive under Freylof, I would anticipate that it's actually just all a band of shield maidens, not the Rohirrim at all. So we have this massive girl boss moment where all of the good women of the Rohirrim defeat all the bad Dunlandings, who are obviously all male. And even though I just said that we would explore how maybe the Dunlandings were the victims in this scenario, no, on the victim hierarchy, they're still male, so they're still bad, and this contradiction in a woke film would be entirely and completely anticipated. And at the end of the movie, when Hera defeats Wolf, she'll do it purely by skill, like he never stood a chance at all, and then he'll like beg her for mercy and forgiveness, making him appear groveling and weak and making her appear more powerful. And then why not gender bend Freylof at that point into actually being a woman and black, because, you know, why not? And then at the end of the movie, we would make some sort of comment about how it's just the patriarchy being the only reason that Hera wasn't crowned the queen. And then throughout the entire movie, I'd expect to have random put-downs of future characters, somehow breaking the fourth wall to tell us that future kings, meaning Theoden, actually aren't that great to begin with, and their entire legacy is built on lies and oppression and sexism, and have at least one NPC in the background of the movie say that they should actually call the Hornburg Hera's Deep instead of Helm's Deep at the end of the movie. None of this happened because for every video that you can show me of someone saying that this movie is woke with frightfully thin arguments and little to no evidence and a hefty amount of ad hominem, I can find you an article saying that it's actually too right-wing, again with the exact same thing. So this whole thing is a matter of perspective, in direct contrast to the Rings of Power, which is why my infrequent part in the culture war has always been to talk objectively about Lord of the Rings, or more abstractly, the art, because quality and authenticity and passion are things that can be objectively verified and measured. Whether or not you choose to see wokeness in this film is a matter of perspective. In fact, the general sentiment of most politically conscious viewers, meaning viewers, not reviewers, is that it wasn't as bad as the Rings of Power, but it still seemed a little woke, or I was disappointed. And I truly think that's simply because of like the groupthink of, I don't think I'm allowed to like this movie without being called woke myself, which is sad. Contrast that to the sentiment of fans who were maybe less politically motivated or politically conscious, and the sentiment is generally positive. The most aggressive accusations are coming from people who either didn't watched the film but didn't read the lore, or did both but still wanted to attack it anyway just for the sake of like winning against the left. And of course that reinforces the narrative, it reinforces the framing, it furthers the ends of the culture war, but it's also baseless and ill-conceived and therefore damaging, because the accusations against this film and the ire with which they're being disseminated is arguably more damaging to the fandom than the movie itself. Like, I'm actually disgusted by some of the language that I have heard used to describe Hera and her importance to the story in various reviews that I've seen. Like, even though Tolkien didn't name her, he would never approve of the sexual and debauched way that some people have chosen to describe her importance to the story, all in the name of winning the culture war. It is appalling to me that anyone claiming to be a Tolkien fan would think that it's appropriate to describe any character that he wrote about with such language. I will not elaborate further because it is actually distasteful to me to think about, and it makes me angry. And the people to which I'm referring, of which there are admittedly very few of them, should feel ashamed of themselves. I don't care if it was a joke, it wasn't funny, this isn't me being a Karen. You can't be a Tolkien fan and use language like that to describe one of his characters. And there are actually people, reviewers and commenters alike, who are invoking the lore and the books as if just saying the lore is an argument, even if you don't know what it is, and then are complaining about completely faithful elements of the film. In some cases, there are political reviewers who freely admit that they don't know anything about The Lord of the Rings or really care about it at all for that matter, quoting other political creators as evidence for their own views about this movie. This is astounding to me, and I don't think I'm ever going to get over it because it feels like a betrayal. Against the Rings of Power, I thought we were all coming from a shared love of Tolkien. But what the War of the Rohirrim has revealed to me is that the people that I thought of as being my allies were not coming from a shared place of a love of Tolkien, but rather simply a hatred of the left. And they have exhibited now a willingness to either argue out of ignorance or purposefully mislead people in order to further the end of winning the culture war. These people have massive platforms. They have a great amount of power to influence people that didn't seem to read the 2 pages necessary in order to understand this film. And I'm genuinely not trying to attack anybody or pick fights with anybody. It's possible I'm misunderstanding. I'm not trying to call anybody out, but the amount of people going around telling everyone that this movie isn't faithful to the lore, that it's an insult to Tolkien, that he's rolling in his grave, and then further claiming to represent the rest of the entire fandom, when the general sentiment of actual dedicated Tolkien channels that did hate The Rings of Power 2, for the record, is that this movie was great and it was a very faithful adaptation. Like, it angers me that there are these people running around saying that this is a faithless adaptation, because it isn't, and all you have to do is read the lore and watch the movie to know that. War of the Rohirrim did not change canon lore, it did not preach to the audience, the marketing did not preach to the audience. In fact, contrast lines in the trailers for War of the Rohirrim, which is people need hope, to trailers from the Star Wars where they say the past must die, kill it if you have to, or trailers from the Rings of Power where they say the past is dead, we either move forward or we die with it. No, the War of the Rohirrim chose to talk about hope for the future in its trailer. And the cast and the production team didn't attack any of the fans. And in fact, in this video, I laid out everything that I would hope to see the production team of a new Lord of the Rings adaptation say, hey, we understand that you've been burned. We understand that modern adaptations don't really have a good track record. We want to do this justice. Please just trust us. We really think you'll enjoy what we have to show, and we want to do this justice. And everything that I asked that the Warner Brothers team would come forward and say, they have now come forward and said. And they did it before the movie was even released. Everything that I had hoped would happen with this movie happened. You'd have to view it through the lens of wanting to find things in it to be offended by in order to call it woke, and that's self-victimization. And furthermore, it's victimizing me and a ton of other Tolkien fans that didn't feel attacked by this film or the people that created it. Like, you can frame anything however you want to in order to get your own political point across, but do not make the mistake of believing that the way that you chose to frame something or interpret something is actually the way that it is or the way that it was intended. This movie is completely neutral, and that's exactly how it was supposed to be. And every time a politically neutral movie comes out, it always flops, because nobody knows how they're supposed to feel about it. I don't know if I'm allowed to like this movie. Does it align with my ideological views? I can't tell. So either the movie ends up fading into oblivion like The Northman did because no one can tell if its politics are aligned with them, so why even bother watching it, or it has controversy manufactured around it and where it doesn't exist in order to actually make it more interesting to talk about. Everybody on both sides of the political aisle tank these films on purpose because they aren't ideological enough for us. And then we all sit around wondering why no movie studio is willing to risk telling just like good non-political stories anymore. And the answer is because our society is so reductive that talking about whether or not a film is actually good or talking about whether an adaptation is actually faithful is just too much nuance to be bothered with. We just want to hear what buzzwords can be associated with a piece of media so that we can just either attack it or praise it based on not its merit and based on not objective reality, but based on however the topic has been framed to us in order for us to have our opinions predetermined for us. The culture war, properly understood, is not a contest between the left and the right. It is a struggle for any country or people to maintain its culture at all. And when you think about the process that we're currently going through right now, the process of the machine, it's actually really convenient that this is happening because the right gets pitted against the left, and then whatever the left doesn't succeed in destroying, the right will come in and destroy anyway, but just for completely different reasons. And the end result is simply that there isn't anything left. That's how you lose the culture war. Morgoth and Sauron would be so proud of the people orchestrating all of this. If you've been told this movie is going to be woke, you will find a way to prove that bias to yourself. And just the same way that if you were told this movie was going to be sexist or racist, you would find a way to prove that bias to yourself. Not because it's true, but because of the way that it's been pre-framed to you. The poisoning of the well has already been done, even if it's just so that you can feel good for agreeing with the person that told you the framing in the first place, because people are tribal and we like to feel like we're agreeing with our side. I genuinely feel that at a certain point, the right calling everything woke has gotten just as bad as the left calling everything racist. And ironically, in response to my saying, I just don't see it, this movie isn't woke, I don't know what you're talking about, I will be told that I just don't get it. But it's totally there, it's just hidden in secret, it's a secret woke, I just have to be more aware, I have to have my woke awakening, I'm just being ignorant. Which is exactly what I would expect someone on the left to say to me. If they told me something was racist and I said, no it isn't, I would be told, no, it totally is. It's just a secret, hidden racism. It's dog whistling. I have to have a racial awakening in order to see it, and if I don't, then I'm ignorant. No, it either is or it isn't. If the offense is so subtle that I have to learn some secret language and train my brain to find and read invisible ink just so I can get upset after I've read it, then no. I enjoy my life far too much to do that to myself. And it all ultimately makes me wonder how helpful reviews calling things out as woke actually are, because it all just feeds the same system. Maybe the fact that this many people leap at the chance to call something woke and attack it is actually a sign that politically leftist messaging has already won. And I will explain. Think about it through the lens. We are all being trained to read the same invisible ink. To say something is woke is to say something leans left politically, that you see that something is left-leaning. You are still being trained to see the leftist messaging, whether you disagree with it or not. People think that brainwashing means convincing someone to believe everything you say is true, or to rewrite someone's brain so that they will agree with you. That isn't what brainwashing is. Real brainwashing is when your brain has been rewritten to see only what someone wants you to see in the way that they want you to see it. That is not the same thing as agreeing with them. It's truly pure evil because it doesn't require you to actually be compliant in it. It's still dominating your worldview, infecting everything and the way that you interpret everything. If all you see is woke messaging everywhere, even if it doesn't exist and even if you hate it, if it causes you to hate things that you otherwise might have liked just because you want to be against woke, it means that you are only seeing things through a leftist lens. It means that your brain is now incapable of analyzing anything from a lens that isn't leftist. Because whether or not you watch a leftist channel that tells you something is woke, and that's a good thing, or whether or not you watch a right-wing channel that tells you that something is woke is a bad thing, it's still only a leftist worldview that both sides are talking about. The outcomes of the right-wing and the left-wing analysis may be opposite, but the analysis itself is invariably the same. And for this, the example that I give to you is the claim that this movie says that Hera is gay. The movie does not imply this, yet there are some people who choose to infer it and then take umbrage with the fact that they have inferred it. Inferring something and having something implied to you are two very different things, because one of them is a choice, and it's a choice which betrays the lens through which you are seeing something. And woke and progressive writers are not known for being particularly subtle. If she was supposed to be gay, they would have said it in the movie. And then we would have all of these leftist outlets going around screaming about how great this movie is for having a gay main character, but they aren't doing that. Not yet. But keep saying that the movie implies that, and maybe they'll catch on, and they will start saying it, and then congratulations, we'll have been right, but we'll have lost ground that wasn't even in contention to begin with. Hera says, I do not wish to marry any man. And she also says, I am bride to no man. This does not imply that she therefore must want to marry a woman. As in Tolkien's lore, I don't think there is a single example of a same-sex marriage, so I highly doubt it since he was Catholic. It would be reasonable to believe and assume that her saying she doesn't want to marry any man is simply the same thing as her saying that she doesn't want to get married at all. If you replace the word man with any one, it makes perfect sense. That doesn't mean she's gay. She just doesn't want to get married. And she doesn't want to get married because that's the only way it makes sense in the lore, as we've already established. And there's absolutely no evidence in this movie that Hera is actually romantically interested in anybody, let alone in women. I mean, she gives Olwen, her mother figure, a peck on the cheek in a tender moment, the same way that Sam and Frodo maybe hold hands in order to comfort each other, or Aragorn kisses Boromir on the forehead after he dies. But that's it. Hera kisses her mother figure on the cheek. Why are we choosing to see sexuality in this? Like, there's a segment of the left that genuinely believes that there is evidence that Sam and Frodo were like secretly in a gay relationship and that Tolkien was writing about it in coded language. And this is obviously ridiculous, but it betrays an inability to recognize and appreciate deep and platonic relationships, and simply seeing everything through the lens of everything must be sexual, everything must be sexualized, even though nothing in Tolkien is sexualized, and very little of Tolkien is actually about romantic relationships unless explicitly stated to begin with. But now, unfortunately, we have people on the right that are doing the exact same thing, sexualizing a completely platonic relationship and seeing a gay romance where there isn't a gay romance. And ultimately, the point about this is, I never saw Sam and Frodo was gay. The thought never even crossed my mind. The books do not imply this, the Jackson movies do not imply this, but now that I have seen and read articles claiming this, sometimes when I'm watching the film, I see a scene and I think, oh my gosh, they're holding hands. Was Peter Jackson actually secretly making them gay all along? Is it woke it all along and I just never saw it before? No, that's ridiculous. But the unfortunate thing about it is that that's what brainwashing is, because once the seed has been planted, once the idea has entered your mind, once you've been exposed to it, it's very difficult to unsee it, even if you know for a fact that it isn't true and you disagree with it. Sometimes that messaging still pops up and it will dominate and taint your life if you let it take possession over you. And it is for this reason that at a certain point, I have to wonder how much of this is a case of controlled opposition, how much of this is just a pressure relief valve to let normal people or people on the right feel like they still have a voice, because at least they can complain about how everything is already dominated by the left. And obviously that doesn't mean that I think that all right-wing or anti-woke content creators are secretly leftists in disguise, but the point remains that unintentionally or not, the result is the same, which is exactly what I would expect from a psy-op, and that is that hundreds of thousands of people are all being trained to see everything only through a leftist lens, even if they hate it. And that would honestly be really great for them, because it's a perfect way for the machine to preach the exact same message to both sides, which is why I think that it would genuinely be more helpful if we actually wanted to win the culture war, to start making videos telling people how we could better interpret films from a normal or even potentially conservative lens, rather than just analyzing things through a leftist lens and then complaining about it. Why not actually do something constructive by analyzing things in a way that's more positive, to give people something else to look forward to? So for your viewing pleasure, and to hammerhand home the point that that framing is absolutely everything, that being upset by this movie is entirely your choice, I will now illustrate to you exactly how this exact same movie, with no changes or additions, could be described as being implicitly based and possibly the most red-pilled movie in recent memory. So feel free to laugh along. People are not going to understand why I'm doing this, and I'm about to be attacked by absolutely everybody, but that's okay. So here we go. The story centers around the actions of a traditionally masculine man, Helm Hammerhand, who is an absolute unit of a man and a complete and utter Chad. He solves problems entirely with the strength of his fists, and he knows that the line of his blood will pass directly and safely through his sons. He has a beautiful daughter who he plans to marry off so that she will be safe, happy, and comfortable. When a petty and lesser member of the landlord class comes before him, insults him, has the audacity to ask for the hand of his daughter in marriage, and then threatens him in his own house, Helm immediately comments on Freka's poor physiognomy, and everybody laughs because it's just so true. Then Helm literally bullies him, tells Freka and all of his soldiers that they're a bunch of soy boys, and then takes Freka outside and murders him right in front of all of his men. And then he exiles his son. When Edoras is eventually attacked 4 years later, he gathers all of the boys to him, and they plan to defend his keep. He has literally never lost a battle before, and he's got everyone there to back him up. And his daughter asks to help too, because she wants to be a courier to him, and it's endearing in a sort of like, Daddy is going to war, and I'm going to help him sort of way. But he tells her, you know nothing of war, which is objectively true. He then tells her that she's not allowed to fight because it's his job as her father to protect her, and she simply goes, all right, because he has authority and she respects it. Hera then offers her horse to her older brother because she just wants to help the men in her family better succeed, and Hama actually shows loyalty to his horse, and horses are based, so this is an implicitly based movement, and it shows that Hama is a respectable man with integrity. And then he recounts the wishes of every man, which is simply to die valiantly in battle and have songs sung about us. Helm then rides into battle with his two strapping young sons, and then later in the film, when everything goes south, Helm decides that the best course of action is simply to punch everything and everyone as hard as he possibly can, as often as he can. And he does this for multiple nights in a row, taking on the entire Dunlanding army with nothing but the strength of his fists, and they grow so afraid of him that grown men literally cry at the thought of encountering him because he's just so large. And every time they hear the sound of his horn, they cower in fear, and his plan is to do this until he or all of his enemies are dead. A very simple plan of action. And then Hera eventually comes looking for him, because of course she does. She's his daughter and she loves him and she wants to know what he's up to, but she's easily overpowered by 2 orcs and a troll. So Helm has to come in and save her. He jumps down an entire mountainside and then punches the troll so hard in the face that he knocks off one of its horns. He then proceeds to box against the troll, and he takes so many punches from this troll but doesn't even bleed, and then Hera, always eager to help, throws a javelin into his eye so that Helm can finish the troll off, in a move inspired by Cain and Abel. And then when Helm has to lead his daughter back into the Hornburg for safety because she is cold, she clings to his massive arms and trusts him to lead her through the raging blizzard, which he does easily and without incident, as he is a man and has a good sense of direction. And then he pulls the heavy wooden gates that have been frozen shut open with nothing but the strength of his arms in order to save her. And then after that, he demonstrates compassion and love for his daughter in a tender moment where Hera tells him that she needs him and begs him to not leave her, but he has recognized that she is a grown woman and that he cannot be there to protect her forever, showing the natural progression in a positive, healthy father and daughter relationship. And then Helm is also vindicated in this moment, as this is why he wanted to get her married off to a Gondorian prince in the first place, as that would mean that she has someone to take care of her when he's no longer able to. And then he demonstrates one of the greatest feats of strength imaginable by fighting an army entirely alone in a blizzard, bare-fisted and half-starved, and he defeats everybody. And I am firmly convinced that the only reason that he froze there was because there wasn't anybody left that dared fight him, and so the lack of action actually caused the blood in his veins to freeze, and that's the only reason that he dies. And when he dies, he does it on his feet, and he is heralded as such a hero that the people renamed the entire fortress and all of its landmarks after him. And his horn was then placed in the top of the Hornburg, and that's how it got its name, where it sat until Gimli, son of Glóin, sounded it almost 260 years later, where it struck fear into the hearts of the enemies of Rohan. In this film, Helm Hammerhand embodies peak masculinity in its purest and most unadulterated form, a male power fantasy. He's got the dad old man strength. He's absolutely ripped out of his mind. He's got a very awesome and long gray beard, and he has 2 strapping young sons that love him and will go to fight for him, which for the record is only 5 sons less than our Lord and Savior Gaston wanted us to have. So he is a powerful leader, he's a powerful fighter, he has the respect of the men that follow him, he has a beautiful daughter that respects his authority and loves him very much, and he sacrifices himself to save her and all of his people, and he dies an absolute legend. You contrast Helm to Wolf and to Freka. Helm has a beautiful and strong family, he values strength and honesty and duty, honor and order, and in the movie, it's Wolf that wants to take over and upset the natural order of the world and let the weak rule over the strong. His vision is one of corruption, and his father, Freka, is fat and he's out of shape and he dies to a single punch. He's sneaky, he's deceitful, he's never on time, he's a member of the landlord class. Helm is actually just too base to stand for this and must enforce the natural order and hierarchy of the world by hitting it into submission. Hera is obedient to Helm and a dutiful daughter. She does not disobey him or question or undermine his leadership. She supports him, she listens to him, and she tends him when he is wounded, and she cries to him, she clings to him for safety. And when she finally does fight at the very end of the film, she does so not because she wanted to or because it was her time or because she was owed the glory, but rather because it was her father's dying command. She goes to fight in a wedding dress in the peak and ultimate display of femininity rather than in armor or leading an army. She causes a simple distraction so that her people can escape. When she does finally beat Wolf, she does so with a shield, not with a sword, not in a contest of brute strength, but rather in self-defense after he successfully overpowers her. The shield is a symbol of protection. It is round and thus feminine, like she is, whereas the sword is phallic, representing male aggression and initiative and action, and the shield represents protection and reaction. And while it can be used offensively when push comes to shove, its purpose is not to attack, but rather to simply defend. like a woman. Hera has a great relationship with her brothers and with her cousin Freylof. She props up the men around her and she helps to support them however she can. Hera is shown to be clever while the men around her are shown to be physically strong. This is a tale as old as time. Look at Cersei from the Odyssey. A woman's power lies in her cunning. This is very well known. Hera tries to use diplomacy and asks that people be shown mercy because she embodies the feminine virtue of compassion, even if it isn't warranted or a good idea. She practices the virtue of temperance and calms, or at least tries to calm the men around her when their blood is hot from war without impeding upon their egos. It is a classic male and female dynamic. Freylof shows duty and loyalty and love of his country. Even when his lord sends him away, he does not become angry. He just patiently waits to be called upon. He does not break faith or become vengeful. Haleth dies heroically, taking down an Oliphant with his strength alone, a feat not seen performed by any other character, and he is only killed because Wolf is a sneak and attacks him from behind. Hama is stoic in the face of death. In fact, all of the men of the Rohirrim face their fates very stoically and strongly, so very strongly, and it is in fact Wolf and his father Freka, the villains of the movie, who whine and moan and complain and cannot accept things as they are. The juxtaposition here clearly shows us that it is good and righteous to be stoic and strong in the face of adversity and to take defeat like a man. The Dun landings are brown and the Rohirrim are Anglo-Saxon and therefore white. This is a genuine complaint from a left-wing reviewer stating that it is a problematic trope carried over from the original Peter Jackson movies, even though it's entirely lore accurate to what Tolkien wrote and it's not political at all. This story's core themes are of love, of family, love of country, sacrifice, honor, and duty. Lastly, we learn from Ken, the great patriarch of the Barbie world, that horses are symbols of the patriarchy. Rohan is a nation of horsemen, therefore this movie is implicitly based. My fellow adventurers, all joking aside, this is a good movie. The synopsis of what Tolkien wrote and the synopsis of this movie are the same thing. This is a very faithful adaptation, as I have hopefully proved to you. It is not woke or riddled with any sort of modern agendas one way or another. Hopefully I have proved this to you as well. And this is truly the way forward. This is a massive win for the Tolkien fan base. We just simply have to be ready to accept that win. For example, in the movie, Helm offers to surrender his life in order to protect his son. He offers to let Wolf win and become the king of Rohan. And if Wolf had had the humility to simply accept that victory, then who knows, maybe he even would have become a good king, but he didn't want that. He wanted vengeance, he wanted to conquer, he wanted to win at any cost. And he had already won, but he chose to keep fighting, and ultimately he actually lost because of that. He let the need to war consume him, and he died a villain. You have to be ready to accept peace. There's no point in fighting otherwise. I do not love the sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the soldier for his valor. I love only that which they defend. The Lord of the Rings is the most important thing here. It is not about beating the other side. If you value beating the other above the Lord of the Rings, then all I can say is that our priorities differ. The story that I love is not a weapon to be wielded by either side. I will not allow it, and I beg you to not allow it either, because this is how things become destroyed. The hard left would have you believe that defending something that you love and that you care about, defending the fandom, is what makes the fandom toxic. This is wrong. But unfortunately, currently, the right is tearing down everything in sight, even if it doesn't deserve it, simply to attack the left, and that is also wrong. Both sides have the ability to make a fandom toxic, and it ruins it for the rest of us. I do not care, I genuinely do not care what your political persuasion is or what you believe, because if you love the Lord of the Rings above, or at the very least separate from, your own worldview, we can be friends and we can enjoy this thing together. And that is why the Lord of the Rings is the answer to the culture war question, because it provides us with a shared opportunity to unite over something good, something that we love, not because it provides us with great ammunition to load into the cannons of our channels and fire at our enemies, but because it's something that we can actually unite over if we're willing to do that. The best way to win the culture war is by creating something new and beautiful. It's by injecting positive things into the culture. You will never dismantle the machine by yelling at it, or by begging other people to fix it for you, or simply by pointing out that it's broken in the first place. If you cannot create an alternative yourself, then the best thing that you can do is help by championing other people that can create something new without the machine, or at least attached to the machine as little as possible, or at least seek to use the mechanisms of the machine in order to build a better one. The best chance we have is massive momentum of the Tolkien fan base united behind the team of the original trilogy. Luckily, there are many people that are fans that just simply do love the Lord of the Rings and are not seeking to fight endlessly in the culture war. I would go on a limb to say that probably the majority of Tolkien fans are in that boat, and I think that I would be vindicated if I were to check the like to dislike ratios of the War of the Rohirrim trailers. But these are people, me included, who just simply want good adaptations, who watched this movie and enjoyed it. And by and large, I think that Tolkien fans did or would enjoy this movie if they did watch it. If they knew the lore of the Legend of Helm Hammerhand and watched this movie without a political lens, but with a lens that came from a genuine love and appreciation of Tolkien. I know for a fact that there are many who felt like I did, that genuinely enjoyed the movie and thought that it was very faithful, and then were just like very baffled and confused to be told that, well, actually, maybe it was woke and you just didn't see it. Maybe you felt gaslit a little bit. You're not wrong for having liked this movie. You're also not wrong if you genuinely just disliked this movie. And for the record, you're also not wrong if you liked The Rings of Power. Now, I may disagree with that, and I may wish that The Rings of Power was done entirely differently. I might take great umbrage with what it is that The Rings of Power have done. But if you actually did watch it, and you genuinely enjoyed it, then I mean, I'm not gonna fault you for that, and I'm happy that you enjoyed it. As a Tolkien fan of the books, and yes, a Peter Jackson fan of the movies, and someone that was highly critical of The Rings of Power when it came out, and I'm still highly critical of it, this movie, The War of the Rohirrim, is a good movie, and it is worth your time, and it is the way forward. I do not believe that we could have asked for like a better version of this, because I cannot think of another way to have told the story without further stepping on the lore more than is already complained about with the version that we got. So we're the ones with the power to push this over the finish line. If we falter now, we may never get another chance at this, because Rings of Power is gonna have more seasons. And it may be irrelevant, but it isn't gone. It's never gonna be gone. And I, for one, do not really want them to be the only ones making the new Lord of the Rings content. And if we are looking at the media, and if we're looking at the way that this movie is performed, it's possible that that may actually be the reality that we live in, and I just don't really ever want to entertain that. I would rather have Jackson back in the Lord of the Rings universe, so we've got to back him up. We've got to back up Peter Jackson. We have got to back the team of the original trilogy. This is like the final nail in the coffin for the Rings of Power, for bad adaptations in general, so do not slap away the hand of an old friend simply because somebody else attacked you and you're hurting. Against the threat of faithless adaptations, the fandom called for aid, and Rohan quite literally answered, so when Peter Jackson calls for aid, we must answer. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, thank you so much, and a special thank you to all of my patrons whose names are appearing on the screen. Videos like this one take an insane amount of time to make, time I couldn't afford to spend if not for the support of my patrons. If this video spoke to you, please consider becoming a member on Patreon with the link in the description. If even 100 adventurers decided to support me for less than a cup of coffee a month, I would be well on my way to achieving financial security and will be able to continue sharing my adventures with you. Thank you for your support.